Specifically fine rain.
Well, it was raining sufficiently hard. I had the head down and I walked straight past it to the end of the road.
Would you like a drink at all?
Um,
There are some beers in the fridge, there's tea and coffee in the other room. You can sort out
can I
soft
grab
drinks.
myself a coffee?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I haven't interrupted.
No, no, you timed it just right.
It's
You got the next one sorted, yeah?
Yes. If you joined the group, you should have had an email about it.
What group?
The DoES Salon group on events.doesliverpool.com.
Found the.
It's funny how everyone did manage to join Meetup all those years ago, isn't it? And now it's only something quite similar and it's beyond them.
I don't even know how I found it. Just by.
On the website.
Yeah, that's what I found. Yeah, the other website. I was looking up deals on this, like, oh, Tom's talking today.
Cool, well that's good.
You're not in any of the groups. You need a Gmail address or do you not?
You do not need a Gmail address, you need an email address, admittedly.
I've got an email address.
But it's, you know,
This one's
open
called
source and
Essentials.
federated and all of the good things.
How do you sign up to them?
Go to events.doesliverpool.com.
It's probably still, well, you're probably not using Instagram, but it's probably still on the story of Instagram.
And yes, next month. We are live, by the way, just FYI. So,
Can you see, is it anyone connected?
I don't know if anybody's connected or not because I haven't really told anybody. I was connected a minute ago. I'm using it more for recording it to then people to watch afterwards. But yes, Ross DL will be telling us about the 3D print club and makerspace that he's helped set up at the Neuromuscular Centre in Liverpool, which is a national centre for people with neuromuscular illnesses, conditions, I'm sure.
I mean, national centres, does that mean people are travelling to?
People travel from quite, I think most of them are locals, but yeah, there are some people who come from quite a way away.
Yeah.
So that will be on the 8th of October.
Is there events slash? Events.doesliverpool.
Yes.
Did you join the group?
Pardon?
Did you join the group?
No, I didn't. I just heard about it and came to hear Tom speak. Assuming he manages to find his phone later.
I think that's what he's on the phone talking about at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's not doesliverpool.com events.
Well,
Very good.
how we use
We haven't done any social media yet.
Should have a website.
So we've got a website which is supposed to be put in some sort of something on the app.
Ah, he has a phone.
Yeah.
Hurrah! We are live on the internet, by the way. We are live on the internet.
We're live.
We are streaming at the moment.
Just streaming out. Fantastic.
We've got a thing.
So, can I get you the mic up?
Yeah, sure.
So you can either little clip or yeah. So that is just for the recording. So I think everyone can probably hear you here. And we have another microphone to pick up audience questions or something.
That's good.
General kind of like polite applause and the like.
Of course, yeah. The odd heckle, the odd witticism.
Oh, we have to be witty as well. Damn.
What's that?
We have to be witty as well.
Witty as well. Yeah, I've got no patience for numbskull heckling. You're going to MC and call things to order, or
In a moment, I'm just hoping that you might just
MC herself.
but she's not going to stand. Hello. So thank you all for coming to the second DoES Salon. And we've got an actual speaker this time rather than me rambling on. I guess the housekeeping, we're not expecting a fire alarm. If there is, there's exits out the way you came in or through the main space, and there's a fire exit out the other way. There are toilets through in the other room. There's a fob on the that kind of yellow thing on the fridge. Will get you into the door to get through. The toilets are the far side of the room. Or there's some downstairs, whichever you prefer. Don't think there's too much else to cover for that. The next talk, I put it up this morning, so on events.doesliverpool.com, the next DoES Salon is going to be Dr. Ross DL talking about the makerspace that he's helped set up and helps facilitate at the Neuromuscular Centre that he attends in Winsford. It's a national centre for people with neuromuscular illnesses, and yeah, it should be interesting to see how they've been they grew out of lockdown and they've been sort of started 3D printing things. Some of it's just like fun stuff like anybody else would do. Some of it's then they've got like a gimbal cup holder to go on your wheelchair so that you can have a cup holder in your wheelchair, things like that. So yeah, it should be interesting to hear about that. That will be on the 8th of October in the evening in here. There is an active travel hack day that I'm organising, also on events.doesliverpool.com, which will be in here on the 27th, I think. That's the Saturday, yeah. So again, sign up on events.doesliverpool.com. Come along, hack on active travel related stuff. It's going to be very informal and depends who turns up and what things people want to work on. But maybe people form little groups. There's some talk of doing some mapping around routes from Edge Hill Station into town to try and talk to the council about making that better for active travel. I was going to do some mapping on OpenStreetMap from the stuff that I talked about last month. And yeah, whatever other things anybody wants to kind of work on. So this evening we have Tom Woodroof, who has a desk here at DoES Liverpool, and an interesting business that he's going to be telling us about. And we're getting a sneak preview of some stuff he's going to be talking about down in Stroud at the Festival of Convenes, which is this weekend. Well, actually, is it Friday, Saturday?
It's Friday, Saturday, yeah.
Yeah, so it should be super interesting. Annoyingly, I'm not going to be able to make it down for it this year. Went to it last year and it was good.
Yeah.
And so we get to hear what he's going to talk about before those Southerners. Without further ado, I shall hand over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and yeah, thank you all for coming. Really delighted to have you here. Yeah, as Adrian said, I have a desk in DoES Liverpool. I've been here for the last couple of years, and yeah, like this kind of event is exactly the reason I'm here, basically, because I sensed it was the kind of space where these things can just happen. and people will show up and, you know, share ideas, get to know each other, collaborate. And it was very obvious to me that there weren't many places like this out here, and so I've kind of stuck, basically. Yeah, so as Adrian said, this talk is actually a bit of a sneak preview for what I'm going to be speaking about at the Festival of Commoning on Friday. And if you haven't had enough of a plug, then here's another plug for next year. There's now a LinkedIn, so you can follow it. The date is already being set. It's typically middle of September. I know Stroud's a bit out of the way, but with a bit of planning in advance, it's perfectly capable or possible to find a ride share, you know, find a cheap place to stay, camping if you wish. There's facilities. So I'd really encourage you all to check out the Festival of Commoning and get it into your calendars well in advance for next year. Just by way of kind of starting with who I am, I guess, I moved to Liverpool about 11 years ago to do a Ph.D. in experimental nuclear physics at the University of Liverpool. But for the last 5 years or so, I've been working on actually a couple of businesses, one of them called Mutual Credit Services. The one which I spend most of my time on these days is Local Loop Merseyside. Local Loop is kind of, one way of describing it, I guess, is a kind of spin-out or project of MCS. We have other projects in the works. I'll come back to at least one of them later. But really, the thing which takes up most of my time is Local Loop Merseyside. And what I also had up here was some of the fantastic people who work with me. There's, of course, my co-founder, Dill, who some of you have met, and then we've assembled a bit of a gang over the last few years. So we've really got a bit of momentum behind what we're doing. Probably the easiest way to kind of, you know, introduce why I decided I had to stop doing physics, and my co-founder Dill decided he had to stop doing architecture, is probably actually just to ask people in the room here, to what extent would you consider yourselves to be collapse aware? And by that I mean any sense of the possibility that society might collapse in our lifetimes. Okay, yeah, that's a good temperature check, thank you. So that's honestly one of the easiest ways I can kind of communicate who I am, because for me that's been, you know, the default worldview I've had since I was a teenager, if I'm honest. I've just known in my, you know, deep down in my gut that nothing about the current system is sustainable. It's not socially sustainable, it's not ecologically sustainable, it's not politically sustainable, it's not financially sustainable. It's just a bubble, basically. And trying to make sense of that and what a kind of sanity-preserving response to that has been a large part of how I've ended up here, basically. So that's the kind of spirit in which I do this work, in which I'm obviously kind of here today. And that's the driver, basically. And so what I want to talk about today, just to give you a kind of brief overview of what I'd like to talk about, and I've actually never really spoken about most of these ideas in public before, and that's not by way of a kind of, sorry, this is going to be shit thing. This is just me saying, actually, what I'd really like to do is not stand up here and lecture for 45 minutes. It's actually just to try and get across a bit of the why, the what, and the how of this project called Local Loop Merseyside as a bridge into this wider thing called the Credit Commons, which seems to me like a sane and kind of sanity-preserving response to the collapse. And so because it's the first time I've tried to kind of lay this out, even in semi-public before, occasionally Dylan and I have done joint presentations to smaller groups, but it's been a while now, and this really is some of this is quite new. I want to take breaks, you know, every 15 or 20 minutes or so, and just see, you know, what actually made sense there. You know, was that coherence? Did it feel like part of, you know, a more coherent picture, or was that actually kind of a bit off-piste, and really that's going to need a bit of work to communicate. So, yeah, starting with the why, I've spent enough time now in the kind of tech startup space to be well aware that typically the way you proceed with these things and say, you have a problem statement, you know, say, what's the problem? And you whip over and up into a bit of a lather about how terrible the situation is. And then, of course, you come in and say, well, we've got the solution and we're going to make loads of money and you should invest in us. You know, that's basically how much of tech works. And I'm not going to pretend that's not powerful. It's a really, really good way to get people's attention, is to state this big, hairy problem and then explain why you're the dream team to deal with it, and why the people listening should get in at the ground floor. But I am going to talk about, quote unquote, the problem, and I am going to talk about a quote unquote solution. But actually, really, it's been fairly evident to me now that it's not a problem we've got, it's like a predicament. And so we can't look for solutions to predicaments, and I don't have a good word for this, I've just got response. There is no magic bullet, there is no solution which is going to just solve the problem, because the problem isn't a problem. It's a predicament, a dilemma, whatever you want to call it. It's not inherently solvable, I don't think. And I guess that's a shift in mentality, which is sometimes quite hard to come by. I mean, particularly when you come from a kind of physics, STEM background, it's really a kind of engineering techno-fix mentality. And I remember having quite frustrating conversations maybe 10 years ago with my colleagues in the physics department about things like climate change, which was way outside of our field of expertise. We were experimental nuclear physicists, but I was really interested in other things besides. And that was one reason why I felt I had to leave academia, because of that kind of tunnel vision it imposes. That's all to one side. But the point was I'd kind of, want to talk about these things because I was still trying to make sense of it myself. And by and large, the response was, oh, that's someone else's problem. The engineers will fix it. Aren't solar panels getting cheaper every year? So that problem solution mentality, I think, is part of what got us where we are now. And I don't really want to pretend like I endorse that, but it is nonetheless a powerful way to kind of set up a talk. So for me, so what is the problem? What's the predicament? I mean, the only really word I've got for it, if I'm honest, or the best word I've come across from it is just like the omni crisis. It's the alarm for the omni crisis. You sometimes hear about permacrisis. I talked about collapse at the start. That's the kind of what I'm getting at there. And obviously there's a lot going on. Systemic breakdown is just a way of labelling it, but it's about a set of conditions and processes. There's a really powerful phrase I've heard recently called the wealth pump, which originates with a historian called Peter Turchin, who takes a complexity dynamics look at history and looks at why societies have collapsed and failed in the past. And very often it's been because of the existence of what he calls the wealth pump, whereby the elites just get better and better at extracting money from everyone else. Society polarizes into a creditor class and a debtor class. You end up with an oligarchy, and sooner or later that fails. So the wealth pump and just financialization, everything these days is for sale, basically. And there's a general mentality that if it's not turning a profit, or it can't be financialized or monetized, as the phrase is, then it either can't be done or shouldn't be done. And that is obviously public health, it's education, it's just everything is becoming colonized by the financial system. It's like ungovernable complexity. There's this kind of thing in the collapse literature of as a society gets more complex, the cost of maintaining that complexity starts to outweigh the resources available to society. And so not only does growth stop, it kind of hits a plateau, and then as resources continue to dwindle due to ecological exhaustion or overextension, actually the complexity which has already been built can no longer be supported, and the whole thing goes into reverse. And what's more, the basis of previous layers of dependency have been hollowed out, and so actually the collapse is much, much faster than the growth phase. And you see this again and again throughout history. Societies just overextend, they get too complex, they basically run out of energy in many cases, and that can be enough, basically. And of course, the kind of peak oil people talk a lot about energy return on energy investment. And back in the start of the 20th century, you could go out to the United States of America, you could dig a hole in the ground and oil would gush out. And for every barrel of energy you put into extraction, you got 100 barrels back. And so it was a bonanza. Whereas now, of course, we're fracking, we're doing deep sea drilling. We're really going to the ends of the earth to get the last juice out. It's getting more expensive to get energy, basically. The investment just stops making sense, everything slows down. So that's the kind of complexity. energy dynamic. There's obviously institutional lock-in. Everything's just getting increasingly interconnected and like sclerotic, basically. You know, you can't change one bit of the system without something else breaking over there. Government, banking, financial system, you know, all of it just completely locked in. Cory Doctorow's got that nice term in shitification. Everything just gets worse every year, in sometimes perceptible, sometimes not so perceptible ways. Seems like another symptom of the omni crisis to me. Everything's more expensive and it's worse and it's harder to get. So that, you know, I think it's, you know, many ways of kind of characterising it. What's really interesting, or I think I've found really salient over the last kind of 5-10 years in particular, is like the latent appetite for change has just exploded. You know, 5-10 years ago you talked about the stuff and you were just a lunatic, whereas now actually everyone, well not everyone, but many people more and more just sense, you know, this isn't right. You know, it's all wrong, it's not working. Even if they haven't quite got to the point of saying it's game over, you know, there is just this sense of like, you know, despair and doom, basically. And for me, one of the really frightening things is that whilst that latent appetite for change has never been higher, and that therefore presents, you know, energy to be channeled, at the moment there's no outlet for it. You know, the only response the system really has is authoritarianism. And so increasingly, I think, you know, we're seeing increasingly vicious political repression, crackdowns on freedom of speech, and just people who are just terrified and frustrated, finding an outlet in authoritarian, simplistic solutions, which are more centralising, more power hungry, and will only ever, in my view, make things worse. Okay, so that's, you know, that, as I say, that for me, that's the predicament in a nutshell. There's more, I'm sure you've all got your own observations. But what's it actually experienced as, you know, kind of day to day? I think there's this really nice phrase called the missing middle. You hear about it sometimes kind of talked about in different contexts. But I just kind of see it as basically the hollowing out of really everything which is good, frankly. Most of our lives are lived in neither as kind of micro-atomized individuals or as a kind of statistical mass. And really those are the only two lenses the system has on us. It's either you're an atomized individual, it's everyone for themselves. You know, you make it or break it alone. And, you know, you're the consumer, whatever it is, you know, the capitalist. And that's very atomizing, or there's a kind of, and that's more a kind of right-wing view of things, then there's the more lefty thing where it's like, oh no, we're all just, you know, a big mass, and, you know, the government can manage things centrally via statistics, and we all, you know, what's good for one is good for all, that kind of thing. And I don't really, like, not really interested in that, frankly, because the middle is where everything is. It's where communities are, it's where places which still have a sense of place feel like they exist somewhere in the middle of that kind of top-down statistical view and the, you know, atomized micro view. The middle is where there's variety, agency, purpose, character, feedback loops, you know, just what actually gives life a sense of texture and colour. That all just feels like it's being eviscerated. You know, I'm only like mid-30s, and I think back to the town I grew up in, where there was a high street and people talked to each other, and it's doing a damn sight better than a lot of places out there, but it is all corporate now. It's just looks like everywhere else. So that for me kind of feels like the day-to-day experience, and I think again that's just becoming increasingly obvious. Okay, so there's our predicament, and I'm not going to offer a solution, but I'm going to say, okay, maybe here's a response, and that is basically, well, what's the obvious thing to do if the middle has been hollowed out, and the micro and the macro aren't, you know, leverage points here? We've got to rebuild the missing middle. Basically, we've got to rebuild that sense of place, community, institutions, markets, which actually give life kind of meaning and texture and sense. And we've got to do it ourselves as well. And I think this is not, I'd like to kind of distinguish this from a kind of reactionary, oh, this is all, everything was better in the past, let's turn back the clock. It's also not a call for reform. In the kind of macro top-down sense, get the government to do the right thing, and it's also not a call for some kind of violent revolution either. So at that point, I'm going to stop.
We were hoping you were going to just lead us out the door on this break.
Yeah.
And then we could come back and kind of, you know, go, how did that go?
I've got you all fired up now, exactly. Yeah, where's the energy?
French Revolution.
Right, yeah, too soon.
It's really interesting. I had no idea that this was the area that you were working in.
Mm.
Quite the reason I moved necessarily. There's a lot of overlap with the things that I'm interested in, and like
Mm.
you say, increasingly people are turning towards these kind of discussions. I've been looking at permaculture, permaculture.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Collapse is a really loaded term in tech, I think, because it means the collapse of other people's understanding what their work is, and
Yeah.
it starts with that, and then it starts to become like, actually, this is all about society that we live in and doing.
Mm-hmm.
There's an operating system called Collapse OS.
Really, I've never heard of that. No.
It's
Okay.
designed as a very, very simple operating system that can be developed by a very, very small team as an alternative to the kind of mainstream, including Linux, including the whole open source thing. I mean, it's a very small project. It's also there's an associated project with DoES,
Mm-hmm.
which is about transitioning from our current reliance on complicated tech stacks to collapse infrastructure where somebody can write a computer that
Mm.
would make sense on the front of a t-shirt and share that information to somebody else. It's very idealistic,
Mm.
but I'm trying to follow it without a computer science degree or any kind of expertise, and it's kind of making sense to me.
Yeah.
In the same way that the discussion makes a lot of sense to me.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. So it does seem to me like there's a very interesting place for tech in all of this, because I think people who work in tech are often keenly aware of this complexity and the pace of change and the basic unsustainability of it. And as you say, questioning like, what is the point of all this? I'm building up all of this, insanely clever technology, which is like, just astonishing. And yet, in 30 years' time, are we going to have that? Is that what's going to be the technological capacity of society then? Honestly. So yeah, I think that's, and I hadn't come across Collapse OS, so thank you for pointing me at that.
Yeah, it's what we call Virgil Duprass thing, but he's trying to get people involved. So if there's something you're interested in, there's a mailing list for it. It runs on Raspberry Pis.
Mm-hmm.
It runs on most architectures, but again, highly technical.
Yeah.
To start with, at least. The idea is that it's going to balloon up quickly, or get involved.
Right.
Skills.
That's kind of part of what we're trying to do with some of the financial ideas I'll talk about later, the credit commons. But it also seems to me that there's a real. So you said you were surprised to hear me frame my work in this way, and that's I don't normally. This is not how I normally start presentations because these conversations, they can go in any number of directions. I did a temperature check at the start and kind of saw, and I had a fair idea of what I was going to hear back. But nonetheless, you never know who you're talking to. You never know, I think it's good to have these conversations. I don't think we ought to be living in denial or should be afraid of them. But it's a really hard one, and it's certainly not an easy sell either, frankly. So yeah, I think there's a real job of work to be done in how do we get good at these conversations, basically, and how do we process, the fear and the despair and the denial, frankly. Sorry, Margaret, yeah.
I was just going to say two things. I'm not free this weekend because a colleague and I are doing training on Saturday morning at the Quaker Meeting House for what's known as the Climate Cafe facilitators. And their role is to hold, at people's invitation, to arrange to have a safe space to talk about these, not so much what to do about things, but what it's actually like to know we're in a time of collapse.
Mm-hmm.
The international, and most people in it have read the book called Lighthouses, and it's starting to put together a sort of a handbook
Mhm.
of what we would actually need to do
Mhm.
when society collapses. I do say when society collapses, thinking about, what sort of things and what we would need in place. It's still very embryonic, but
Mhm.
some of those people are definitely going to the Festival of Commons.
Thank you.
Greenfield
Mar-
is
right.
speaking of the festival commons. He wrote that book.
Yeah.
I keep meaning to check out that WhatsApp group that you mentioned. So I know Adam, I've known him for, I don't know, like a decade or so. Can't remember. Quite a while. So I keep thinking we should get him to come and do a talk about lighthouses a bit. That would be
Yeah.
interesting. I need to work out how to cover his expenses at least. I don't know what to do like, but it'd be nice to. I read it when it came out. There is a copy. Have you got my copy?
I've got your copy. Yeah. Yeah.
So are you on the WhatsApp group then? Or? Yeah. Is it useful then?
There's a lot in it, and I get a bit overwhelmed by it, so I save them up and then deal with them
Right.
in a chunk.
That's kind of partly why I'm not on it.
Yeah. Never mind the collapse. You've got too many unread messages.
That would be the good thing about the collapse.
Yeah.
Stop the kind of
Stop the
inbox
chatter.
filling up
Yeah.
on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Is the festival going to be recorded? Or?
It will be. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure. I don't think it'll be. It might be live streamed. I'm not certain, but it will certainly be recorded. And yeah, there's a couple of other people from the kind of collapse community speaking as well. That's not the emphasis. It's very much meant to be it's meant to be a much more positive, upbeat thing. But it's also very much like grounded in that way of seeing the world, for sure. Yeah, thank you, Margaret. No,
Can I also just do a plug that on the 4th of October, we at Transition Liverpool have a day that some of you probably already know about on circularity, and it's really looking at the whole area of how do we start from the grassroots to rebuild local communities, and how do we make our economy circular so that we're not throwing things away all the time. We're managing with what we've got. There's a free lunch, it's 10 till 4, it's at the Quaker Meeting House, and I think, Tom, you've got the details.
yeah.
It's a poster on the
Great, so there's a QR code if you're interested and you're not in so much burnout you can't face one more thing.
Yeah.
Do come along.
Sorry, I think Michael was up next, and then.
I'll share a couple of things. One is, and you may already know about this, but picking up on your point before, Tom, about difficult discussions, isn't it, and these sorts of difficult conversations. So there's something in the book of philosophy and popes.
Mhm.
Are you aware of that?
No.
So it started, it's national, maybe even international these days. It started in Liverpool. It's changed its name to Philosophy in Public now. But the basic idea, other people can explain it better than me, but there was a group of people who did a philosophy degree, mature students in their 40s, 50s,
Hi, Sana.
bricklayers and people like that. A
Mhm.
friend of mine who's one of the founders, he was a bricklayer by trade, did a philosophy degree in his 50s, loved philosophy all his life. And like you do when you finish a course, went to the pub afterwards and said, oh, we should carry on this, and they actually did, and then they became self-sustaining.
Mhm.
And so in Liverpool, if you go on the website Philosophy and Popes, you'll find there's all sorts of ones. I'm going to one, I think, next week. It's in my diary, it's dead interesting.
Mm.
But I think they're specialists in it. Isn't like, I'll give you philosophy in a pub, with a pint in your hand. They're all trained in how to encourage debate really, about
Mhm.
all sorts of difficult topics. So
Mhm.
it's not just like Plato and Aristotle, it's why are we here, what does art mean, all sorts of interesting subjects really that anyone can raise. So I think it'd be really interesting for you to try and engage with them, because they've got skills
Okay.
It takes you into different types of audiences
Mhm.
where people might not agree with anything you've said,
Sure.
but they'll be quite open to, that they'll be aware of how to engage
Mm.
in
Mm.
a respectful way. Like any sort of open source community thing like that. You know, the idea of a pub was anyone can walk in, it wasn't elitist.
Okay.
So you know, I've been to some where you do have people who, you know, I've been to one years ago where there's people someone there who swore she heard ghosts all the time. You know, so who knows, maybe she did, maybe she didn't, maybe it was mental health issues, who knows really. But you've got that very open in the community environment, so I think it's worth you thinking about. The other thing they'll chip in is in my journey on this, I'm just a lot more positive these days, and it's hard to explain why in the time we've got here. But I'll give you a sort of counter example. A friend of mine who I used to work with, he was the scientific advisor on The Day After Tomorrow, if anyone remembers the movie. He's on the DVDs and the extras. His name's Michael Molitor, American guy, geochemist, chemistry of oceans is his Ph.D. in areas of research and so on. And yeah, he got pulled in by that guy Roland Emmerich, who did the film, and you know, and yeah, it's all in there about, you know, the thermal lines, you know, to stop it and all that sort of stuff and so on. But one of the things that happened, if you remember that moment, and that tied in with things like peak oil and transition, sort of, you know, Ed Miliband was speaking to I forget his name, the founder of Transition, and so on. And if, you know, there was a whole sort of, it was sort of peak, you know, engagement, if you like, at least at a policy level, I felt. But when the DVD, if you can picture the poster for Day After Tomorrow, has a picture of the Statue of Liberty and it's all covered in snow, if you can picture it. But what happens is, and what I think happens if you give people too much negativity, someone has photoshopped some people skiing down the slopes.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, people just think, you know, what the hell? If we're going to hell, then I'm going to go skiing, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we have to recognise that really. And my friend Michael, I mean, he was taught by the guy who created Roger Lavelle, I think his name was, who created the Hawaii, you know, CO2 monitoring station that all the data comes from and stuff like that. And he got criticised by the scientific community, what on earth are you doing? And, you know, it's not, you know, scientifically rigorous. So you say, what on earth are you guys talking about? This is Hollywood. He said, for the first time in his like 20 years that he was at there, he got invited on Richard and Judy, basically. And so you're sort of in that sort of, you know, how do you engage people in a way where you will engage them and you won't just hear the Jesus out of them?
With great care.
Is an ongoing challenge. But I think it is a challenge.
I think absolutely. In fact, thanks for pointing me at the philosophy in pubs. Thanks. And I couldn't help but wonder whether that might be. Margaret talked about the climate cafes and, you know, having those conversations with people. If that might be
climate
just a
fresk. Is it a climate fresk? Do you know climate fresk?
No, I don't know that. This is overseen by the Climate Psychology Alliance, and it's just a structured way of people being able to talk about things they wouldn't talk about because they're really scared, particularly about this collapse that no one says is going to happen, except the government did test it out near a bomb system.
I did get that one over those text messages. Yeah. Okay, I think we are, probably now maybe 40 odd minutes in, which is possibly slightly alarming because normally the why is the fast bit and it's the how which takes forever, is my experience. So maybe one more point maybe on the discussion.
Hey, I mean, it's just something you mentioned, just when you mentioned about the technology and how, I just wanted to, I probably already know, but part of the reason I'm here is because I'm trying to get the technology out, which I believe could play a part in a similar way that your beliefs in how that part of finance just makes me happy because I can't think on that side of it, but the barriers of how you're forced into bridging that gap when we've got a piece of technology that works, that could be cheap, that's zero carbon, but how do you get from having that to a place where you installed it.
Is that the fuel project? We emailed back and forth a bit.
Yeah.
Sorry, I hadn't put a
Yeah.
face to the name.
That's all right. Yeah. So it's just like that. How, well, in this country, for sure, like you're pushed, whether you go through university, whether you
Yeah.
go through any of the accelerator programs,
Yeah.
you're pushed to creating a product that, well, really towards patents. They don't even care if the patents are good or not.
Obsession over IP.
So then,
Absolute obsession with
and
IP.
it's like, you know, I've gone to speak to people and like, okay, yeah, so you just like, you don't want to make loads of money and leave.
Yeah.
You actually
Exit and
want
IP.
technology
Yeah.
that works, and
Yeah.
that there's no support for that. So
Yeah.
just to kind of reinforce what you're doing.
I will actually, interestingly, I will get to, okay, how do we finance this thing and how do we exactly stop so many good and necessary technologies from just the commons as a whole, which is the kind of next topic of conversation. How do we actually stop that from ending up in the missing middle, basically? So that feels like a nice, convenient segue, thank you. And hopefully I'll say some more stuff which feels kind of pertinent to that. Okay, so on to we've talked a bit about the why. We've had our break, had a discussion, a bit about the what. So I talked a bit about the missing middle. I kind of said I've got this quite strong sense that it's actually, it's the bit of our lives which feels increasingly under attack and increasingly hollowed out as the crisis, the Omni crisis, commences and the system breaks down. And said a few things about what I thought, some of its positive facets. But really briefly, I think there's another view on it, which is, okay, what is it not? What can we never expect to get back through the typical lenses on the economy in particular, but also on political economy, the micro and the macro? In my view, we're not going to get through this by saying, oh, right, we're going to go into kind of survivalist mode, that very kind of individualist American style thing where you just stock up on, grenades and protein powder. No, not interested, frankly. That's that kind of micro-atomized view of, there's just you, basically, against the whole rest of the world. Not interested in that. Also the macro lens of, that whole, oh, right, it's got to be one-size-fits-all solutions, and maybe the government will legislate our way out of this with a totally kind of blunt instrument of policy. And if we just get the statistics right, it'll all kind of be okay. No, not really interested in that either. So it's neither of those things. And I don't think we're going to rebuild the missing middle with either of those levers, frankly. So that's maybe more kind of negative characterization of what I don't think it is. And so I guess my contention is that building commons, and that's the next kind of thing I want to introduce, is a sane and sanity-preserving response, not a solution, but response and approach to filling in the missing middle. So the next thing for me is commons. And I forgot to say, hi Sana, thanks. Just to bring you up to speed, we started out with a bit of like, why is commons interesting? Like, what's driven me into this kind of strange, kind of fixation on finance and commons and that kind of thing. And now we're kind of moving through a bit. Yeah, okay, so again, so the next question is, well, what is the commons? And often, I don't think anyone really owns the term. You hear a lot of people use it in a lot of different ways. Sometimes you hear it used in ways where it's often quite clear that the person themselves hasn't really, frankly, thought all that hard about what it is and what it isn't. I think sometimes there's a lot of conflation of commons with public goods, or people who think that like some kind of vague sense of public-private partnership constitutes a commons, like the local authority working with members of the community in some sense, like consulting with them, that is in some sense a commons. And it's like, well, okay, that's a good thing, but like I don't really see how that's particularly different from what's come before, honestly. It might be more collaborative, it might be more inclusive, it might be more participatory, all great stuff. It might be more democratic, all great stuff. But like, it's not new unto itself, if that makes sense. It's still very much the public sector and the private individual having a slightly different relationship to each other, and might be a better relationship, but it doesn't, to me, feel like anything, certainly nothing sufficient, and certainly, frankly, nothing to get all that excited about, if I'm being a bit rude. So it's not, so okay, so if it's not the public sector, it's not the state, it's not public goods, and it's not private capitalist ownership, It's neither of those things, and it's not just a rejigging of the relationships between those things. Okay, what exactly is it? And to my mind, and many of the people I work with, the most interesting body of work around commons is the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who some of you might have come across. She wrote a very famous book called Governing the Commons, and she looked at, it was an empirical work. It was really interesting. It didn't start out as a work of kind of abstract economic or political economic theory. It was actually, if anything, a really strong reaction against a completely, theoretical and frankly ideological attack on the commons. There's a really famous piece called The Tragedy of the Commons, and that phrase still gets used. It was a paper written in the 1950s by an economist called Garrett Hardin, and his kind of agenda, basically, I don't think that's too strong of a word. He was very, very right-wing capitalist, and it was in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was the enemy, and he was really against anything to do with the state. And so he basically did a bit of a hatchet job and conflated the public sector and the state with the commons, and then said, yeah, that just doesn't work. The only solution to prosperity and to sustainable management of resources is to privatise them, because if someone owns them and they see it is in their best interest to perpetuate that resource, then that's what they'll do, and therefore everything should be privatised. That's the only way. Private property rights are the only way to manage resources. So it was a complete hatchet job made on the basis of little to no evidence. It was just an ideological hit piece, but it got massive amounts of, because of the political climate at the time, it got huge amounts of support. And ever since then, Tragedy of the Commons has just been a shorthand for saying you can't have nice things, as far as I can tell. People can't be trusted, they can't organise themselves, they can't govern themselves, they can't have nice stuff. It's got to be enclosed and privatised. And Ostrom kind of reacted very strongly against that, and she kind of looked at empirical examples, contemporary and historical, and said, well, hang on, both the state and private capitalist property rights are very recent things which have only appeared in very particular parts of the world, but humans have been, living in society for hundreds of thousands of years. So this just can't be true. It's just obviously not true that people aren't capable of governing their own resources in the absence of either state regulation or private property rights. So let's look at, what works. And she wasn't saying it always succeeds, but she was interested in saying, okay, what are the principles under which people can self-govern, and what are the failure modes which cause that to break down? And she derived 8 empirical principles for governing the commons and wrote a book about it, I think back in the 90s or something. And then much of the rest of her life's work was actually around linking that up to other disciplines, like the history of human evolution, the evolution of cooperation, early societies, all that kind of stuff. So she wrote this great book, Governing the Commons, and for me that's that's the strongest, clearest and most compelling, not definition, but kind of understanding of what the commons is. So I'm very much aligned with Eleanor Ostrom. So yeah, maybe just, again, maybe it's time for another pause and just say, can people think of examples of existing commons, commons we still have? Because there was, of course, famously in England in particular, the enclosure movement in the early modern period, where the feudal lords just threw all the peasants off the land, dispossessed them from what had been often common grazing land. And of course that actually became part of the labour pool for early capitalist wage labour. These people just had to go into the cities and work in the factories of the Industrial Revolution. So that was one of the circumstances which led England to be, become the British Empire. And yeah, we have this particular history of enclosure, of commons and dispossession, but we still have place names like, the Common, a lot of places still, and there's still a cultural memory of commons around, and they haven't all been eviscerated. So at that point, can anyone think of any commons which actually feels like it fits that, even approximately?
No, they are coming, but I went on a tour of Liverpool with people from Scout Farmhouse.
Ah.
And we went on a neighbourhood tour, which is quite fun. And we were talking a lot about burial grounds and sacred ground as well, being kind of overlap with that, and how there were lots of memorial spaces around Liverpool that are, I don't know what their legal status is, but to my mind they're common grounds, nobody lays claim to them in the same way. Like the Wesleyan chapel sites, things like that, where people communities coming together to work the land in the old, in agriculture and cultivation, settlements and cultivation. That's what I think the commons still is, but I'm sure people will challenge me on that.
It was a good example of it, and I think it would be meet the criteria. So Calderstone's Park, Calderstone's Park, there was a part of it that was going to get sold to, I think, Redrow Homes, if anyone has followed this, and the community came together as the car park and so on. Community came together, I was only on the edge, I wasn't involved at all, a friend of mine told me about it. And they came together and campaigned successfully against it and so on. And they've turned it into a nature reserve. It's really nice.
Yeah.
I didn't go this year, but the year before was lovely. Again, the challenge with all those things, and whether Adrian recognises this with us and stuff, it's the economic sustainability of these things. Again, when I've done Friends of the Earth over the years, you know, you thinking about the economic sustainability of these is really important. Because you burn through your volunteers. That's my experience.
I think, kind of following off that, DoES is arguably commons.
Yeah.
Like it's providing kind of access for the community to an event room, to kind of desks to work from, and there's a working out how you finance it. But things like the fact that you can only book the next visit to the laser cutter is our way of managing access to those common bits of machinery that are kind of held for everyone to use. So there are some rules around it, so you can't just decide to enclose it and have it for yourself for a month. So I think that there's some of Ostrom's principles of the fact that you need a way of defending the commons.
The number one rule is there's a boundary around the commons. It's not a free-for-all. It's not a public good. It's not show up and fill your boots. It's absolutely, there's a boundary, and it's not necessarily a wall. It's often more like a membrane, but that boundary has to exist, and it has to be monitored, and sanctions have to be raised against people who violate their rights and responsibilities. So it's not free for all, exactly. But it's also not a thing where exactly you enclose it and say it's mine. I'm going to charge rent for it.
I suppose we do charge rent for it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, the thing is, we do, but you don't. You don't turn up and just you don't seize it. The community The community governs it.
Yes.
And we're not a collective. But we're also not just a set of individuals. I don't think we're a collective. That's not the term I'd use for DoES.
I don't think so. We're lots of different weird things.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have that as a start.
Yeah.
I suppose that my example doesn't fit the criteria then because it's not actively known what sacred ground is anymore. It's not a policed thing, or it would be very difficult to do that. So again, I guess you'd have to recover that sense of sacredness for those sites.
Got to do politics, basically. Yeah, Margaret.
Scots Flower House is a good example of it.
Yeah.
It's more like activism, isn't it? Really? It's sort of community activism.
I think that's one of the it's a good thing to highlight because a lot of groups and camps and Scots have been involved in trying to be accessible to everyone through their fails because it just ends up being, like say, core people burn themselves out,
Yeah.
or people come in and change things and take over and do what they want, and it's not just interesting.
So Margaret.
I think the most successful commons thing that I know of is Linux.
Interesting.
Is it commons? You guys are good? I don't know.
This is a really
It is to me.
Adrian, go on.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that kind of in it, and I think maybe it gets away without one of the things with software because the non-rivalrous goods, is that the term where basically if I have a copy of Linux and run it, that doesn't stop you from being able to. So like the laser cutters, we've only got 3, and so if they're all 3 of them being used, nobody else can use them. But if somebody else turned up and wanted to run Linux, we could be like, yeah, you can install it because it's software, and we can just, so software kind of feels like the open source is sort of a commons, but also a little bit kind of gets away with being a bit more of a free for all because the cost of the next one is kind of basically zero. So like,
There's no more around the edges there.
To me, it's like it's not a commons because it requires such a lot of technical knowledge that it is, and
but
in
like
many
the commons
cases
when you're going to
unnecessarily complicated ways of doing things that could be rewritten in a very simple way. You maybe in like principle, I agree.
Well, I don't think the technical knowledge is there because, like, so Cambridge has an assortment of commons, which are patches of grass in the city centre, and it's kind of a bit weird because they actually still graze cattle on them. And so you are just cycling there. I would cycle to work when I lived in Cambridge, and you would go past cows that are on the common, and every now and then they'd get moved to one of the other commons, and I'm not sure exactly what the rules are, but it is more like a traditional commons. And like, there's quite a lot of knowledge I'd need to be able to graze cattle on the commons. Like, so yes, I've got a lot of technical knowledge about computers, it means I can run Linux quite easily. But like, I think we need a different level of technical knowledge to be able to do animal husbandry
But if
and
you
raise
wanted,
a
if
cow.
you wanted to, you couldn't just contribute to the Linux kernel just by collecting the necessary, because it's kind of game cat. Like that's
Right,
my
okay. But that maybe makes it more of a commons because there's actually, there are some boundaries around it, and so contributing to it is a commons maybe.
I would think, like some people can change Linux in ways that's against the interests of other people and stuff as well. They can move things. It's not necessarily, it can change and not be in the interest of all people, but I don't know if that's against it being a commons.
I'm seeing it in light of like the things that you were saying at first about if the world, if the society does that, are we going to be able to run this, or are we going to have to do this? I don't know, the answer to that is no, which is why we've got collapse OS is why we've got these things, because we just couldn't have things like Git, because they're just they require too much collective energy, historical tools that we're all building on top of.
That sounds like a very much convivial technology, even at Illich type critique. Are you familiar with even at Illich? Yeah. Sounds like very much that kind of critique is that, past a certain point, tools become so powerful, so complex, so fast that they're just out of reach of humans, basically. And even and you might, some people might be able to govern or to manage or to contribute to those tools, but they sometimes turn into a kind of technocratic priest class and gatekeepers. And whether they form their own little commons and they have a great time doing that and they do manage it, effectively. I'm sure, at a certain scale and complexity of society with enough specialisation and enough resources, that is absolutely, viable. As you say, the interesting question is, as that viability becomes less and less, supportable, how does that play out? Is it a commons if it is just, a set of highly technocratic gatekeepers who de facto exclude everyone else just because they have such specialist knowledge? That's as I understand it very much where even Illich kind of comes from.
Yeah, human scale technology.
Yeah.
I throw another name in again, just if it's used. David Putnam. It wasn't not the film guy. It's a guy who wrote a book in the 80s, American guy. His whole thing, bowling alone. American, you know that one?
Yeah.
He was the one who I think is credited with the idea of social capital, which again feels like in a Venn diagram, it feels like it overlaps with ideas of commons and so on. And I always thought that book was, and the message of that book was really powerful, really, because it was, for people who don't know it, he did loads of research and basically said in the past in the States, I think it was mostly the US, his research, people used to be in bowling clubs and all sorts of clubs, and so you just get loads of that intermittent in society, whereas again it's a stereotype, but you might not know your neighbour anymore and all that sort of thing. So again, all the points you've said, atomisation and so on and so forth. But to me, once you've got that sort of view, that can be measured, can't it, and improved really. And again, something like this tonight is the equivalent of a bowling club, isn't it? Really? It's,
We have bowling, but they're all cranberry, but bowling.
No, but you know, again, in a city like Liverpool or anywhere, you know, you could try and encourage and support and give grants, and you know, there's all ways that you could, you know, you could improve things by encouraging more of this sort of thing. You know, touch pays less on its council tax or you know, something like that. Again, it all systems will be a game, doesn't it? You know, there'll be about 100 crypto clubs a day. Yeah, I think social capital is an interesting idea.
Okay. So at that point, I'm going to, again, I don't know how people are feeling about time. I realise we've been going on for a while now. Kind of another, how do people feel? Should we be halfway through, 2/3 of the way through, 80% of the way through? Do people have a feel of where we ought to be now? Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, I mean, I'm going to call it around 2/3 of the way through, if that sounds about right for people. Yeah.
Anybody want any non-alcoholic drinks?
I would mind.
No, no problem. No. All good. How was your day? Okay. Yeah, nice. Thank you. We'll talk about that later.
Do you know somebody else who knows how to pass it?
Do you know any theatre?
Yeah.
That'd be great. Like he doesn't do the first text side of it, he does design governing sets, the works at Adams, so might actually be
Right. Yeah, it does. I haven't seen it. I didn't seem to come to the
Wasn't it the open day?
It's a bit academic. They're definitely like, yeah. It has just been put on. Yeah.
Harrison Commons, climbing commons. It's like does but for climbing walls.
Yeah. It's becoming more and more like that sort of stuff. Not only because popular first and stuff going out of the 50s years, but like the idea should get better, the idea of going mainstream, like nothing is just a sign of times. Like, that just says it's all the fact that they were trying to work out complex. Yeah. People
probably the most.
I did search around with Austin, that's it. I did search around with
But just so I see the
how I used to be so much.
practice still there.
I'll pass it on to him. We have these conversations with him.
Okay, are we all feeling like we're ready for more good stuff? So where we left off maybe 5 minutes or so ago was, we were talking about what are some examples of commons which we can identify already existing or historical. And that all sounded pretty good, right? Sounds good. Certainly does to me, honestly. The cattle, I didn't know about the cows in Cambridge. I knew about the New Forest and the kind of commoning tradition which has survived there, and always been, without fully understanding it either, because what the hell do I know about grazing? Just seen it and gone, I'm glad that exists. I'm just glad that survived. So for me, commons really kind of, resonates. So that's great, and actually I've added something here. I've said material commons, because although I know the software, the technology stuff is, virtual, digital, all the same, this feels very much like it's kind of infrastructure for living of one sort or another. And it's not like, there's an economics of it for sure, but it's not itself just economics, and it's certainly not finance. So the question for me, or part of the question for me is, okay, if this sounds great, and it feels like it's a, a bit of a way to maybe start, filling in the missing middle again. The question is, okay, if we had this stuff before and it's been taken away from us, then how do we not just build it and immediately have it, eviscerated again? If we had it and it was taken away and you haven't dealt with the forces, the dynamics which took it from you, you can see how that might end up a bit futile. So, okay, so how do we finance material commons in a way which doesn't mean that they immediately just get eviscerated, basically? I think Ostrom actually has a technical term for what happens to a commons when it gets predated upon, basically, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it is not eviscerated, but I just quite like that word. Hollowed out is maybe a bit gentler, but and so that is really what the focus of the work, which I've been doing with an increasing number of people for the last 5 years or so, is about, and we call it the credit commons. We say, okay, what is the financial infrastructure which is going to finance the material commons? And of course, it's very much the material commons which matters. The finance is a means to an end, not the end itself. And of course, that is very deliberate, because what we see increasingly these days is that finance is the end unto itself. Money is like the vortex around which everything orbits. It's just completely come to dominate everything around us, and become totally ungovernable, and has become, a law unto itself, basically. And so, if nothing else, the credit commons is got to be a bulwark against that financialisation, against that wealth pump, and against, the supremacy of money over absolutely everything. But okay, so how are we going to do this financing? Well, I'm pretty sure the banks aren't going to pay for it. I'm pretty sure venture capitalists aren't going to pay for it. Charities, maybe a bit. Commons projects might get funded by charitable or philanthropic money, so I'm not completely ruling that out. But it's not going to actually challenge the system, honestly. The government, again, it might, at the margins, you might get some funding for, some socially positive projects, which might be explicitly commons, but they're not. That's only going to last until the funding runs out, and then, yeah, may or may not be it. So the credit commons has to be a self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, viable, and the kind of nerdy technical term here is like endogenous form of finance. It's not something which is like outside of the communities and the infrastructure which it's seeking to finance. It's actually got to be within it and part of it, and actually coupled to the real value production which is taking place. Otherwise, that money is always going to cost you something, and very often the infrastructure which you thought you owned, you're going to pay for it 3 times over in the form of debt finance, or you might just end up forfeiting it, or when the funding runs out, you'll have to pack up and go home. So the credit commons has got to have a business model, if I'm honest, for want of a better term. It's got to be able to wash its own face at the bare minimum, and if we're serious about the commons actually transcending the current system without being, and I kind of said earlier, I don't believe in reform, I don't believe in revolution. So what's the third alternative? Well, it's actually like transcending the system. And if it's going to do that, it's going to have to be able to finance itself, basically. There's got to be, again, to put it in the kind of peak oil people's terms, energy return on energy investment. Maybe not literally energy, maybe not literally, more money being made than being spent in a profit sense, but it has to be like viable, basically, for want of another word. And that's obviously a really strong requirement. But again, I'm pretty convinced that it's not going to be the banks or the state which is financing this work at any meaningful scale, honestly. And if they will even finance bits of it, it's going to be like on extractive terms of one sort or another. Okay, so that's the ambition of the credit commons, basically. It's got to be a set of models, tools, mechanisms, platforms, understandings which enable the self-financing of the commons on the basis of its real value production, not speculative, not relying on debt, just not the current financial system, basically. And so where we've arrived at with this, and I'm not going to kind of, the term credit commons has been around for a while. There's a guy in the United States, I think, called Tom Greco, who is quite well known in mutual credit circles, and he started talking about the credit commons, I think maybe 20 years or so ago or something. Another guy called Matthew Slater is one who I think is most associated with it these days. He wrote a mutual credit protocol called the Credit Commons Protocol, and that was actually, one of the first things I encountered on this. So the term Credit Commons has been around for a while, and I'm not going to say what the Credit Commons is definitively. A bit like Commons, it's got many understandings, but I would absolutely say the work I'm doing is front and centre. We are building the Credit Commons. And for me, really, what the underlying theory of the Credit Commons is it's a synthesis of 3 different disciplines, academic disciplines, but often subsets within. The first one is commons governance. We talked about Ellen Ostrom, and that's very much a kind of political economy angle on things. It's how can groups of people self-organise and self-govern and manage their own resources in perpetuity without privatisation or top-down regulation by the state. So that's a kind of political economy angle on self-governance, basically. And I think a very powerful one. There's monetary theory, there's credit in here. There's a really interesting kind of strand of economic anthropology which looks at the history of money in different societies. And it's really astonishing because we've been so disempowered by the current monetary system, and the way it feels like a law of gravity. It just feels like this, you just don't argue with it, you just, obey, basically. Because you've got no control over it, there's no upside in arguing with it. Nobody's ever probably given you a coherent answer as to what the hell it actually is anyway. And you see what happens to people who don't have enough money in their pockets. So, why would you argue with that? You just hope you don't end up that way. But there is actually, if you know where to look, there are some very sophisticated understandings of what money is. And if you, again, there's a strange kind of gulf between our experience of money as this kind of force of nature and the fact that it changes under our feet all the time. It's the biggest shift, I think, in the last, in relatively recent history was when Richard Nixon, I think it was in 1971, just unilaterally declared that the dollar was no longer coupled to gold. That had been the basis for the US dollar as the world's reserve currency system from the end of the Second World War through to the 1970s, and for all sorts of reasons, mostly because it was perpetually at war. America was starting to have problems having enough dollars, basically, and backing them with sufficient gold in Fort Knox. And Richard Nixon just realised that this position wasn't tenable, and also was actually hamstringing the United States in some ways. And he just declared over a weekend, the dollar now has nothing to do with gold. And ever since then, the dollar has just been, floating on the currency markets. And that just completely changed everything, basically. The rise of the financial system since the 1970s, the increasing entrenchment of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. None of that would have been possible under a different monetary substrate. If the dollar was still backed by gold, or if the dollar still was gold, or if, the dollar was any number of other things, the whole kind of global financial system just couldn't have taken place. And so money's like a really deep layer down the stack, and it's not really hard to see from that lens how if you've got a society which uses clay tablets as their form of money, which is the oldest form of money we have a record of in the ancient Near East about 5,000 years ago, the origin of writing was records of debts and credits amongst palace economies, and grain stores in particular. You can see how a society where their monetary system is carvings on clay tablets is going to have a different financial system, and therefore a different set of markets and a different sense of social relationships to one where it's based on gold coins, which then appeared a couple of thousand years later. And again, that's going to be a completely different system to a credit-based financial system where it's actually not about gold and commodities at all. It's about social relationships and promises, which is what a credit ultimately is. And so economic anthropologies look really, really carefully, and it's completely exploded the myth in mainstream economics, that money before money there was barter, and then there was gold, and then there was paper money, and then there was credit. The Adam Smith narrative, just completely, there's no evidence of that at all. It's not how it happened, and it couldn't have happened that way. And the best book on that is Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, where he just lays it all out and just looks at how different monetary systems have influenced the evolution of societies and what has been possible for them, and how that has related to imperialism and slavery and war. So it's fascinating stuff. And if you don't have time to read a book about that thick, I would recommend a blog by someone called Brett Scott called Altered States of Monetary Consciousness. It's hands down the best contemporary writing on monetary theory I've ever come across. And he looks at the way the global financial system actually works, its relationship to the state, the way in which that conditions markets, the way in which that conditions governments, what it means to grow up in such a system. It's just fantastic. So I'd really, really recommend that. So that's plank number 2. We have the political economy, Ostrom's governance. Then we've got a sophisticated understanding of what money and credit actually are and what finance really is. And then the final leg of it is complexity economics. And that is yet again another thing way out on the academic fringes. Paid no attention whatsoever by mainstream economists, routinely kind of rubbished by them and said, yep, that just isn't true. But I think it's probably didn't take me too long to work out once I started actually paying serious attention to economics that the mainstream academic economics and policy economics is nothing to do with the truth. It's all about power and maintaining the status quo. And they viciously attack anyone who critiques their kind of just so narratives about the way the system has to be the way it is, and it's inevitable. And again, I can recommend some reading for people if they want to kind of get into that complexity economics place. But some of you might have heard of the Santa Fe Institute, for example, out in the United States. It's this fantastic research centre which has been around since the 80s, where basically a bunch of renegade scientists from all different disciplines, it was like biologists, computer scientists, physicists, just took a look at the state of economics and just went, we can do better than this. And they consistently have been ever since, and they are really pioneering. Some absolutely fascinating concepts in network science. It's also quite closely related to cybernetics. Kind of had a bit of a moment in the kind of mid-century, rise of early computing. But it's all about self-organisation and feedback loops. It's actually very similar to ecology in some ways. It's just all about complexity and self-organisation and system dynamics. And it's just fascinating, basically. And to me, it provides a really rich lens on the growth, collapse, self-organisation, diversity, innovation, variety we see in the economy. It just accounts for it in a really satisfying way and has all these really powerful tools like network science, like computer modelling, all sorts of great stuff. And so for me, that's the third thing. That's the lens on the economy, which we need to actually understand what the hell is going on and start designing and building effective interventions. So for me, the Credit Commons is a synthesis of all of those things. That's the theory of it. Okay, and that sounds very interesting and obviously very nerdy, but okay, great, what are we going to do? And that's where, the practice comes on. And so, okay, what actually in tangible terms is the Credit Commons? What can we use these insights to actually do, which is going to make a material difference? And that is really, frankly, the origin of Mutual Credit Services, MCS. The reason why my co-founder, Dill Green, and I started working together was to develop these understandings, do this research, and say, right, can we start developing models for the real economy which encapsulate this understanding in a set of tools and platforms, protocols, agreements, legal structures and business models to actually bring this stuff to life and try and take it mainstream. And so that brings me just up to the brink of the how. So I think I might stop there for a couple of minutes only.
One quick question. The advisory groups, do you feel like Stafford Bay territory?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
There was the guy that Julian worked with at Scrape.
Oh God, I
He
can't
was
remember.
into Stafford Bay, wasn't he?
He'd worked with Stafford Bay, hadn't he?
Yeah, skinny guy. What was his name? He was another Cambridge guy, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, sorry, you mean Francis Irving?
Yeah, wasn't
Yes.
he? Oh, he
Yeah,
did.
he was. I was thinking because they went to North Wales to visit somebody kind of retired who had worked with Stafford Bay. I can't remember who it was now.
Yeah.
Just slightly kind of eccentric sort of academic or something that they went to visit. But Francis was because the LJMU have the Stafford Bay archives. And so there was, I think maybe even the first ever DoES epic trip was to go to the LJMU Stafford Bay archives to look through it, which I was away so I didn't go on it.
Just to give maybe some more connections that were put on, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Where's Francis these days? Is he-
He's down in London these days. He's running an interesting series of talks about land ownership at the moment.
Yeah, so that, as I say, for me, that's the theory of the credit commons. Got those political economy, economic anthropology, monetary theory, and complexity economics, and that's the theoretical underpinning. Margaret, yeah.
Can you recommend any books
On each of these?
on the whole area of complexity economics?
Yeah.
Something that I understand ideally.
There's a really, the book I always recommend as the place to start with this is, I think it's just called Economyths by David Orrell, who's this really excellent researcher, and he's actually, and so, sorry, did you get that, Margaret? Economyths. It's like 11 reasons why economics is nonsense, basically. Published post-2008, not surprisingly after the financial crisis, when the bottom fell out and all the economists were saying, nobody saw this coming. Not surprisingly, there was a bit of an upsurge of interest in people doing serious research into how systems can just collapse because of too much complexity, because of too much coupling, because of systemic risk, because of network effects. And that was where the complexity economics kind of put their hands up and said, yeah, we've been working on this stuff for 30 years now. And actually, they did get some traction. The Bank of England for a time had a unit dedicated to agent-based modelling, which is very much a complexity economics approach. So it is slowly starting to go mainstream and get some serious attention, but it's still way out on the fringes, honestly. Yeah, sorry, Margaret.
Sorry, it's me again. What do you think of credit unions?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, I'm very glad they exist. I don't think they're going to change the system. A bit like I feel about cooperatives, to be honest. They've been around for 150 years, and they looked like they were going to be a radical challenge for a while, but they've been pretty thoroughly tamed at this point. They're great, not knocking them, but they're not going to, they're necessary but not sufficient, I guess.
I watched it's called 97% Owned.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good.
And after watching that, I realised that any money that we have isn't really much anymore. I mean, it buys stuff, but it isn't what people think money is. And it also links to, if there's a collapse, you won't be able to get money out of the bank because money is only something on a ledger online somewhere. So there will be no money.
And that I mean, I would like to massively, expand on that and say all sorts of things, but you're very much getting into monetary theory there, and how does the system actually work versus how is it presented to us? And yeah, 97% owned is great. And again, I'll just point you at Brett Scott and his Altered States of Monetary Consciousness blog for just the best writing I know of, which actually really gets into the guts of this stuff. And he talks about layers of money. He doesn't really go into the whole, this is funny money, or this is not real money, or it's all an illusion. He says, well, no, actually, it's not any of those things. It's actually, it's a structure, it's a set of institutions, it's a set of plumbing, it's a set of technologies. It's obviously a lot of political power and ultimately the threat of force, don't pay your taxes, go to prison type stuff at the end of the day. So he really kind of dives into a lot of the, the myths on the left and the right actually about money and kind of the blinkers a lot of people have right across the ideological spectrum. It's just great, honestly, just fantastic stuff. But yeah, complexity economics, again, I'd say David Orrell's Economyths is definitely the place to start. And there are some very, very good follow-ons I can recommend as well later. Yeah, it's really good. Oh yeah, and then just to round that out, so what's interesting is I think obviously there's a lot of people talking about political economy, and the commons is very much having a moment at the moment. There's a lot of people talking about commons. The economic anthropology stuff, because they're anthropologists, they absolutely understand complexity. They're not simplistic or blinkered. They really have a rich understanding of societies and different cultures, but they're very much coming from the social sciences, so it's all quite qualitative. They don't really do maths, basically, in short. Really rich, thick descriptions, and a real commitment to getting at what actually makes a society tick. But they don't have, heavy-duty maths to, model stuff. But they really get kind of complexity in a qualitative sense. Then you've got the complexity economics community who have all the mathematical machinery. Again, it's typically like physicists, engineers, systems biologists, computational people, and they really get complexity in a kind of mathematical sense, and they've got brilliant models and like a really sophisticated understanding of dynamics. Almost none of them understand money. These communities do not talk to each other. David Orwell does. He's the guy who wrote The Economist. He's one of the few people I know of who actually spans both, and that's where we try and put ourselves as well. Is they're both necessary to really understand how finance and economics and money actually work, and what's more, how we can use that understanding for design, basically design and build stuff which actually stacks up. And so that's the how. So okay, so how do we build the credit commons? Okay, I think that's finally where we've arrived at. And just to maybe wind right back to the start when I talked about the why, and I was talking about this kind of systems breakdown stuff. So that's kind of very much just to return to the theory of change stuff. Well, okay, who are we going to build for? Where are we going to start? The economy is huge. There's many places we could look, but where are we going to be most effective? And we think that there are places we can be more or less effective. And the way we kind of characterize those is to look for places in the existing economic system where there are entities, should we say, could be people, could be organisations, who've got a lot of agency still, because there are bits of the economy where people actually still have choices. It doesn't feel like it a lot of the time, it feels just a wage slave or a consumer. It doesn't feel like you've got a lot of choice, but there are still pockets of the economy, which I'd say probably, small business owners might be one, or people buying a house. You actually exercise quite a lot of economic agency. So there are times in our economic lives where we actually do make meaningful choices. High mobility, actually an ability to, like, if they, they're not completely shackled. And also these places in the system where there's actually quite strong feedback loops. Like if you're a small business owner, you're absolutely at the mercy of the corporates. Yes, it's hard to get a loan from the bank. Yes, you can't, revitalise your high street single-handed, but actually your choices do really matter. Like you can employ people under different conditions. You can choose your suppliers, you can choose your customers. There's actually quite a lot of autonomy in running a small business, and obviously that's why a lot of people are drawn to it, despite the fact that 80% fail in the first 5 years, or whatever the statistic is. People keep doing it because they just sense that there's some actual autonomy to be had. So small businesses are interesting. I think they fit those high agency, high mobility, strong kind of coupling feedback loops to other bits of the system. And I think, as I say, buying a house is another time in your life when actually you are kind of quite close to what capitalism kind of tells you are, which is, actually you've got money in your pocket and you've got choices. So those are two quite kind of interesting little corners of the economy. So that's where we start, actually. And MCS has 2 live projects at the moment, each of which is aimed at those little corners of the economy. And so I guess I might summarise that by And the approach then is, having identified them, is to basically offer them a better deal and make it really easy to say yes. And the interesting thing is that gets easier and easier as the system collapses. As the current deal on offer gets crappier and crappier, actually, doing better than what the system has to offer. The bar gets so low that actually, in a very perverse way, the job gets easier. The hard part is really not so much offering a better deal, it's making it easy to say yes, particularly I think as people get more and more frightened, people just get risk averse, and so novelty often presents as just another threat. So it actually gets, it's a tricky dynamic. But that kind of seems like the job, basically, in a nutshell. So I guess you could kind of characterise that as looking for the cracks in the system, where are the chasms opening up, and can we just plant a little seed in those cracks? Okay, so if small business owners and home buyers are the people we'd like to be the commoners, because if you don't have commoners, you don't really have commons, in my view. What are we designing and building which can bring them in to the credit commons? And Local Loop Merseyside is the small business finance project, trying to meet that objective. And then down in Stroud, where the festival is happening, we've got a project called the Housing Commons, and we think we've basically figured out how to bring houses into community ownership permanently without debt finance, basically. And I won't go into that now because, as I say, that's a whole project in its own right, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on around housing commons, and yeah, that's the subject of a whole other thing, but I think it's pretty exciting. So yeah, that's where we're at now. We're well and truly into the how, and so the rest of my talk is going to be about Local Loop. What's that all about? And again, probably maybe pause here and see how much appetite people have got. And also just to say that, you know, Local Loop is the thing I do day in, day out, and I can go into endless detail about the how and the nuts and bolts of it, and I know I mustn't, but I'm also around, so, you know, this is not your only opportunity if you really want to nerd out over Local Loop. Yeah, it's not the end this evening. What are we thinking, maybe 15, 20 minutes just for a... Let's have a 2-minute discussion and just kind of see how we feel on, see how much energy there is in the room after that.
So, I'd like to test. So, one of the things you said, going back a bit, about how the economy changed a lot for mixing, changing from the gold standard. So, I wonder what your thoughts are. I'm not read in any of this area at all, so maybe it's something that's discussed a lot, but tying that back to something which is not able to be owned, such as energy, where there's a lot of work within engineering and materials. You've got embodied carbon, but there's also people looking into embodied energy, and we've got this calorific value, which is energy. So there's a lot of this stuff that's already documented in this energetic value, and then the work that you do, payment based on how much energy you need. So in terms of recoupling that, just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, and that's very, very interesting. So it seems to be like a really, like a lot of people just draw an intuitive connection between money and energy. You know, some people say, oh, like, you know, money is like energy, it's like a flow, and if you run out of it, you know, so people kind of often see there's like some kind of metaphorical similarity. And I think that, you know, it's a mental model of money. I don't think it's necessarily the most useful one, but it seems to be like people often intuit that there's a connection. And I think there really is, in as much as, and some of what you're touching on now is almost like, well, what's it backed by? It's like, and also, what do I need to live? How much energy do I need to, like, what's the energy budget at work here? I think there is one thing which I've missed out here deliberately because I haven't done enough thinking about it, is ecological economics, which of course is all about energy flows. I don't either know enough about that to really kind of add another plank to the synthesis, so to speak. But I'm convinced, you know, the economy absolutely runs on energy. You know, if it wasn't for energy, I think Steve Keen has this nice phrase, machines would just be sculptures. So, like, yeah, and it's another blind spot of mainstream economics. They have no comprehension whatsoever of the role energy plays in economics and society. And there are also all sorts of proposals around kind of explicitly coupling energy and money, whether that's saying energy ought to be backed by money, which is one kind of, you know, and that you know, if you want a very, I guess, hard, solid monetary system, you know, saying that the dollar is backed by, you know, oil, which in some senses it is, you know, and, you know, how, for example, how have the Russians been able to, you know, survive sanctions? Why hasn't the ruble collapsed? Well, actually, they've got a huge resource base, which includes a lot of energy, and that can back their currency. So there genuinely is like a very strong relationship between commodities and energy and money, and how do you have a viable currency? And then, of course, coming from another angle, you hear people who talk about like carbon credits, and they'll say, oh, maybe if we like calculate the carbon budget we've got before we just completely blow through, you know, X degrees of warming, and we issue a kind of tradable energy quota type thing where you say, right, this is our carbon budget, we're going to issue credits corresponding to that amount of carbon, and there's a kind of like trade mechanism where, you know, anyway, so there's all sorts of projects out there, and as you can tell, I've still got a lot of thinking to do about it. I don't know, was that helpful, or was that just
no, just because in my head a kilowatt is a kilowatt,
this is a really nice thing about an energy and there's also a distinction between an energy-backed currency, which arguably the US dollar is, versus an energy-denominated currency. And I've actually got a lot of time for denominating different credit units and different units of account, would be the technical term. It's like, well, you know, if your productive capacity is energy, in this case, if you have a community-owned solar farm, which is pumping out rated for X kilowatt hours of electricity, and you want to finance the investment into building out more capacity, actually issuing, you know, vouchers for kilowatt hours of electricity and selling them is not an insane thing to do, because if you then sell them to people and they present them back to you and say, I've got a voucher which says, you know, 10 kilowatt hours worth of electricity and you've got the capacity to deliver and they're your customers, that is actually a totally viable setup. You sometimes hear about solar dollars, for example. So yeah, I do think there is, and I think this is one of the weaknesses of our current monetary system, honestly, is that, you know, we have national currencies which in some sense are understood to represent like a basket of commodities. It's like, oh, you know, your pound is, you know, it's simultaneously a token for like rent, for food, for transport, you know, for consumer goods, and that causes all sorts of, first of all, confusion, but it's also like a really dumb reductionist thing. You know, there's not enough variety in one single monetary unit to cope with the incredible variety of the real economy. And so I do think there is actually a place for sets of different, I guess, specialist currencies for financing different sorts of activity, and that if you can get beyond the one single dumb like pound sign, actually that itself opens up a design space and say, you know, could we finance electricity through kilowatt hour vouchers? Could we finance community food agriculture through veg box vouchers? Could we finance you know, steel production through vouchers for, you know, tons of a given grade of steel? Whatever the case may be, I'm sure there's a whole set of possibilities which open up if you can really get to grips with that.
I've been reading quite a lot of religion books by a guy called Patrick Whitefield.
Called?
Patrick Whitefield.
Okay.
I think he's died recently, but he talks a lot about in terms of expenditure of effort and often conflates energy with effort expended by people, but also by ecological systems. He works a lot with farmers who are rewilding. Talks about how you can do that in an effective way that works with reserves that are already there, which is, I know, but slight tangent here, but when you're talking about building land, to me that sounds like expending energy to
Right.
do that. And to me it's like the problem can be approached slightly differently, which is that you try and quantify what resources you do have already, and in so doing generate resources from nothing because they weren't previously tried.
So like a stock flow analysis type thing.
I don't know what the
Okay, yeah.
It's working with what we have, but in a way that is analytical first, and then
Right. Yeah.
It's just interesting that you're not using the word permaculture, and that does diverge somewhere from this, because it does tend to think of humans and
Yeah.
ecological needs, and priority is not necessarily building new cultures or ensuring the continuation of human culture. It's we're all going to die.
Right.
The planet's going to, we need to make sure that.
Yeah. I mean, so the thing that, you know, when I talk about financing material commons, I absolutely see like it's building safety nets at this stage. You know, it absolutely is. It's like, you know, can we finance the community-based infrastructure, including, you know, permaculture, food production, which is going to soften the landing, basically. That's all I'm really interested in right now, at this stage of the day. Margaret?
I guess what keeps coming back to me is something you mentioned, David Brady's book, looked at the first 5,000 years, and he looked at the origins of money back in what he refers to as the Axiom Age.
Yes, yeah.
800 BCE to 200 whatever after. The foundation and why it emerged during that time was firstly because people were moving from pastoral living to living in quite complex societies, so they had to have a way of exchanging goods. But secondly, and I'm thinking this is really relevant to collapse, they were able to do it because I'm not advocating the religious bit necessarily. They had a religious system where people would conform to certain values. Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, they're called the whatever Israelis were called in those days. But they all had this this moral code. They might have differed between them, but it meant that there was a fundamental trust within a society that meant that people believed that if they exchanged something, that it was a safe thing to do. And at a time of collapse, I guess the problem is that might not be there.
You're exactly right. This is one of the major themes through Graeber's work. He looks at the distinction between credit monies and commodity monies, and most people think money is a commodity, which is why their heads get so scrambled when they take out a £10 note from their wallet and go, how come this coloured piece of paper gets me nice stuff down the shop? It's just a piece of paper. Why doesn't this piece of paper do the same? And again, there's no upside in going too deep into that, and nobody's got a sensible answer, so you just stop doing it after a while. But it's real, like this cognitive dissonance of this thing appears to have some kind of intrinsic value, but it's just a scrap of paper. And of course, the reality, and this is what Brett Scott lays out so well, is that it's not a commodity. It really does have no intrinsic value. You can't eat it. You can't make anything useful out of it. It is a fancy piece of paper, but it's also not an illusion that it has purchasing power, because it is backed by the state and by the banks and by institutions, the military, the power to tax, and that makes it a credit money, not a commodity money. It's a set of relationships which are sometimes based on trust, and that's very much where the kind of mutual credit, time banking movement comes from, is that money is a credit relationship, and that relationship ought to be one of trust rather than coercion. Of course, the reality in nation states is that there's no trust between really us and the state or us and the banks. There's merely, there might be confidence. You might have confidence in the continued existence of the bank or the state. You don't really trust them though, or it's just outright coercion. In the case of backing money with the threat of violence through taxation and putting people in prison or the military. And so one of Graeber's themes is exactly commodity monies and credit monies have both existed throughout history. It's actually rare you get a pure form of one or the other, even things which look like commodity monies, like the gold coin with the stamp on it. It looks like a pure commodity money, but it's not. They would only circulate within often largely within the political bounds of the authority of the ruler who had stamped the coin. And so even though that looked like a commodity money system, it was absolutely in many ways a social relationship and therefore a credit system. So the common thing is hybrids, but Graeber says, he draws this connection, as you say, history has often gone through phases where as society breaks down and collapses and trust disintegrates and war breaks out and often slavery is heavily involved, like in the Roman period, it was commodity monies predominated because people just would not take credit from each other. They would not trust. They want settlement on the spot. I'm going to take your gold or your silver as payment, and I'm probably never going to see you again. And that's the end of the transaction. No extension of credit, no trust, no relationship. And then in more peaceful periods, and also not surprisingly ones of relative prosperity, credit money systems predominate. And so actually after the collapse of the Roman Empire, when formal monetary systems basically disappeared from Europe, one of the really fascinating things is that people continued to use the denomination of the Roman Empire. They would talk about trading in monetary units which were unchanged from the Roman period, but there was no actual payment of physical money. It was just all done in accounting and bookkeeping, and they called it imaginary monies basically. And there was this whole period where, again, money just was not circulating in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and yet trade didn't stop. People just did it on terms of credit and accounting and bookkeeping. And of course that's when early accounting and banks actually started to emerge in the late Middle Ages. and set the scene for the origins of the modern credit-based money system. So yeah, like Gray was great and all this stuff. And there really is a relationship between the type of money in use and collapse, prosperity, stability, and trust. And you know, you've probably gathered by now I come down hard on the side of credit monies as desirable because they are based on trust and stable social relationships. Not to say that are also, frankly, much more viable than commodity money systems, which are often incredibly unstable and cause all sorts of problems. You know, the gold standard was, you know, economically disastrous and completely unmaintainable. Even for the British Empire, it didn't last for very long. It's basically unworkable past a certain level of scale and complexity. So yeah, I'm very much wanting to build the credit commons, not the commodity commons. But there we go.
Is credit just loans or debt? What do you mean by credit?
So, I mean, so a credit and a debt is it's the same relationship, looked from different ends. You know, one person's credit is another person's debt, and in bookkeeping that's completely well understood. You know, what is it? Assets plus liabilities, assets minus liabilities. Yeah. Anyway, the bookkeeping equation and double entry bookkeeping. You know, the books must add up. That's all about relationships of credit and debt. And yeah, it's the same thing viewed from two different perspectives. Whereas of course the commodity money is like, well, I own it, it's mine, it's my lump of gold, it's my tin of beans. There's no relationship involved. It's a thing, not a relationship.
The dollar, is that a commodity money or is that?
It looks like one, but it's a credit system through and through. It's absolutely a credit system, and there's a good reason for that. You know, the commodity monies just cannot support a certain level of economic complexity. They're very, I mean, not to get too deep into the weeds of it, but like, if you want more money, you've got to go dig it out the ground. And that puts an inherent damper on economic growth. And because one of the system's main imperatives is economic growth at all costs, not surprisingly, that was one of the reasons why Nixon had to go off gold in the 70s, was because the United States economy couldn't expand, or they couldn't dig enough gold out the ground and push it in Fort Knox fast enough for the American economy to expand. And so that was one of the systemic drivers which caused him to take it off. And since then, you know, the brakes were removed, and hence, you know, the rise of the financial system. So there's a lot of layers in the stack, if that makes sense. And again, Brett Scott talks about these different layers: the state money system, the reserve banking system, the commercial banking system, the kind of private layers like PayPal, which have been built on top of that. And he breaks them all down, but it's credit all the way down, basically. And again, the question is, of course, okay, well, what backs that credit? Because although it's a relationship, you can't just, like, I mean, you can will it into existence if you're the government or if you're a bank. Most people can't do that. But at the same time, you know, hyperinflation is a thing. If you print too much money when there's no backing of it by real goods and services, you know, you will just add zeros. So, yeah, there's a relationship for sure. But no, it's not. The dollar's not in any meaningful sense a commodity money. And no modern monetary system is a commodity money. That is not workable.
Is crypto stuff, is that a commodity?
It's really trying hard. If you look at the branding around crypto, it's all like digital gold. It's trying really hard to market itself as a commodity, and a lot of people in the crypto space are gold bugs. You know, they're like, oh, the gold standard was the best thing, and you know, we want real money, we want sound money. There's a lot of ideological rhetoric and a lot of marketing and branding effort which goes into making crypto feel like a commodity, but it's not, because ultimately it's completely virtual. It has no intrinsic value or use. It's a kind of pseudo commodity money, and that's why if you go into crypto spaces, you see so much cognitive dissonance. It's just bizarre. So it's not, but it's trying really. It thinks it is. It's trying really hard, and that's one of the reasons why crypto is so volatile. That's a characteristic of commodity monies. The price just fluctuates wildly. You know, if the gold supply increases, the price of gold goes down. So the price of the commodity itself is inherently volatile and subject to, you know, random supply and demand things. And if you base your entire economy, everything is denominated in gold, that means the prices of everything in the economy just gyrate around the price of the commodity. And that's, you know, when Britain was on the gold standard. If the price of gold went up, the whole economy had to jump. And if the price of gold went down, it could cause, you know, a massive economic crisis. So that's why they're not workable. Well, that's one reason why they're not workable, and why we don't use them, basically. So, yeah. Right, okay, I really am going to crack on at this point and maybe try and bring things to a close with, I think, saying, okay, so where we've got to is Local Loop is an attempt to make this, is to build a model based on this theory, this understanding, which is an attempt to get small business owners into the credit commons. So I'll really just kind of blast through, okay, what might be the requirements for such a project. It's got to bring immediate financial benefit for SMEs. You know, in marketing speak, it's got to address a pain point. There's got to be a value proposition. Small business owners are busy enough and have a hard enough time keeping afloat as it is. You know, ideology, manifestos aren't going to cut it. So it's got to have immediate financial benefit. It's got to be better than the status quo, and it's also got to be better than doing nothing. It's just a big thing in, like, you know, when you're trying to sell something, you know, you are competing not just against your actual competitors, but you are competing against just ignoring the problem. That's a very real alternative. It's got to not have the systemic feedback loops diluted if we're serious about systems change. You know, if we just offer another financial product which helps your cash flow, you know, gets you paid faster, then you're basically just a bog standard fintech. You're just trying to make some money selling a thing which people are willing to pay you for. So we've got to not lose any of the systems change stuff whilst we're trying to also be out there in the mainstream. And that's obviously, like, one of the hardest bits about this is how do we not get co-opted? How do we not just end up being chewed up and spat out, or just throw fuel on the fire, you know, become just another growth accelerant, basically. It's got to be self-sustaining. It's got to have a business model. You know, it's actually got to be able to, like, perpetuate itself and grow organically without external financing for longer than absolutely strictly necessary. It's got to be able to, as I say, get that energy return on energy investment in one form or another. It's got to have a roadmap deeper into the credit commons and decoupling. Particularly if you're talking small businesses, you've got to start small and careful, pretty risk averse generally, super busy, you know, really just wanting something, you know, immediately beneficial, but also quite safe and, you know, not disruptive to their status quo. So you've actually got to start really, really small and ambitious, but you should have the potential, if you can deliver on your promise, to, you know, make their lives better in some obvious, immediate, tangible, meaningful way. Hopefully you've got stuff waiting in the wings to follow up on that opportunity and say, if you like that, you know, wait, what we've got for you next. And, you know, so there's got to be a roadmap. That's necessary. It's got to be scalable as well, honestly, at this point. Again, like, the economy is, the UK economy is like £1 trillion or something, I don't know, but, like, something which, you know, isn't, at least has ambitions to kind of get towards that order of magnitude, as absolutely insane as that sounds. You know, again, at this stage in the game, you know, it's what I'm interested in doing, honestly. Even if it still takes a very long time. It ought to be reproducible. It ought to be something which, okay, if we prove the concept, the model, you know, it's, yes, because we've committed years of our lives and a lot of resources to it, but it ought to be far easier for other people to, like, replicate it with a lot less money, a lot less time, and frankly, far less of an insane overcommitment to mad stuff like this. So yeah, it's got to have mainstream potential, basically. Those all seem like quite hard requirements to me. That's, like, the job. And so Local Loop is our attempt at a design which fits the bill, basically. And so now I think at that point, probably the best thing I can do is just a really quick kind of show and tell as to where we're at with Local Loop. What have we actually designed and built? Where are we going with it next in the next couple of months? If that sounds like it's cool. So what Local Loop actually is, and this is on the topic of going mainstream, we've been accepted onto Liverpool City Region's tech incubator, Liver Labs. I stood up and pitched Local Loop a few months ago in front of, you know, just a very, frankly, mainstream crowd of people, and we're on, basically. We didn't get the funding which came with the incubator because we fell at the final hurdle, which were the venture capitalists who took one look at our governance and legal structure and basically were like, what the hell? So we've paid yet again we've paid a price for being weird, but, you know, we passed the kind of, you know, the scrutiny of everyone up until, you know, we got to the VC tier. Everyone else said, yeah, sounds great, sign us up. So again, we're relentlessly focusing on, you know, trying to, frankly, you know, get in and get resourced by the mainstream. So yeah, I've got a bit of a, like, this was part of the pitch I gave. No, that's not it. This is the pitch I gave a few months ago, and it's still not a bad place to start. So I guess, yeah, running really quickly through some of those requirements. Well, okay, what's the value proposition? You know, why are people even going to bother to use this? Well, we've just seen that late payment is a huge problem for small businesses, basically. It stresses them out, drives them bust, damages their relationships, causes all sorts of issues. Okay, we've got our value proposition. We think if we can alleviate this terrible experience of being a small business owner, that's something which is worth paying attention to. Okay, so what's our solution? Basically, what we see is that a key cause of late payment, for which there is currently no solution, is people saying, like, I can't pay because I haven't been paid. And they phone up their customers and they say, well, I haven't been paid either. And they phone up their customers, oh, I haven't been paid either. And it's a domino effect. And that is a network effect. It's one of these things you can't, it's the missing middle thing. It's like you can't understand that phenomenon from the micro point of view, from one person's experience, and you can't understand it from a statistical top-down view. It's an emergent dynamic of networks of businesses trading together, issuing each other invoices, hoping they've got the money in the account, and paying when they can and not paying when they can't. And that's absolutely a network dynamic. And we just call those payment gridlocks. And the interesting thing is we did a bit of research, and at any one time there's about £200 million worth of invoices outstanding between businesses in Liverpool City region. There is just a huge amount of debt between small businesses, which are then financing each other. This is not bank money. This is not money from the government. They're sending each other invoices and they're accepting each other's promises to pay in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days time or whatever the case may be. That's a credit relationship right there. They're collaborating, they're trusting each other, they're extending credit, but it's insanely risky. There's no coordination, there's no means of coordination, and they pay the price for it. And so what Local Loop does basically is it says, right, well, £200 million worth of outstanding invoices between Liverpool City region businesses, huge amounts of that locked up at any one time in these gridlocks. I can't pay because I haven't been paid. Right, let's have a look at that. Let's look at the debt network and basically turn some graph algorithms on it. It's an optimization problem. It's saying, given the set of debts we have between each other, defined by the invoices, and given the amount of money we have available, what is the optimal routing of that money through the debt network to ensure that everyone gets paid faster and with less risk? And nobody's doing that out there, apart from the banks. They've been doing this literally going back centuries. And it's just called clearing. You sometimes hear about clearing houses. You hear about check clearing, for example. It's a financial term which is, can be traced right back to the Middle Ages. And in fact, I mentioned earlier that for a long time after the fall of the Roman Empire, there wasn't much circulating gold and silver. For several hundred years, most of the European economic activity was financed at trade fairs every quarter. Merchants from all over Europe and the Near East would come and they would trade, and they'd do most of it on accounting and bookkeeping. They would trade with each other, they'd keep records in their books. That would result in a whole network of debts and obligations. Of course, they didn't have network science and graph algorithms back then. So they did something astonishing. They would stand shoulder to shoulder with each other, and they'd form physical circles, and they'd find loops where they could cancel out debts around the loop. And because it was just such this insanely dense trading network, and they had these quite sophisticated ways of detecting opportunities to settle without payment, they would typically eliminate about 95% of the debts without any money changing hands. Anything still outstanding, they'd pay in cash, and so they'd bring a small amount of money with them, but hardly any. Most of the things they'd roll over to the next trade fair. And that went on for hundreds of years. The whole European economy was basically financed with smart bookkeeping, credit, and the precursors to modern bank clearing based on network science. So yeah, in a sense, none of this stuff is new. And many bits of engineering, graph optimization problems, flow problem, min-max flow problems, are just like it's just a known problem, basically.
When did that stop?
Mostly because of the rise of maritime trade, you know, particularly as like deep ocean going vessels started, and it became more about Amsterdam and London and the kind of Atlantic coast, and economic activity moved away from the European heartlands in France and Germany. That was one of the reasons. But also those clearing fairs actually gave rise to like modern accounting and banking practices, and it became institutionalized, and it stopped being a thing the merchants did amongst themselves, for themselves, and it became this like institutional, like, you know, thing, which then became modern banking, basically. Yeah, and so what we've seen basically is that with the adoption of digital accounting software by small businesses, you know, Xero in particular is just eating the market. You know, small businesses are just adopting Xero, and making tax digital is coming in. That's going to be a huge driver of adoption of digital accounting platforms. Probably for the first time since the Middle Ages, honestly, it's been possible to do clearing at the community scale, and because of digital software, we can now, that data is increasingly out there. It's just like siloed, and so what the first thing Local Loop does is it just says, connect your Xero, connect your QuickBooks, and we get a live feed of invoice data, and we can then construct the graph, the network of debts in the local economy, and we can then run clearing on that. And again, like, clearing has been around for hundreds of years. It's understood as like bookkeeping operations by the accountancy and banking profession, but you can absolutely recast it in mathematical terms as like graph theory, and just treat it as a flow optimization problem, and you get basically the same result, but much faster and better in other ways as well. And the effect of that for a small business owner who is participating in this clearing system is that basically their debts get paid a lot faster, their cash flow is eased up, they spend less time chasing payments and getting stressed out and screaming at their customers. So it's got the obvious financial win. It also has that strong systemic feedback loop, because the more of your trade you do in the network, you go from a situation where like the more likely you are to get caught up in a payment gridlock to actually the more likely we can clear your debts for you, the less bank money you need, the less reliant you are on the financial system, the better relationships you're going to have, the more incentive you have to trade within the Liverpool City region. So it meets that dual criteria of what's in it for me value proposition, and if people care about it, which most people don't, it also has that like, well, it will rebuild the local economy. It will encourage local circular trade. It is rewarding collaboration. It is something we can govern ourselves for our own benefit. We've set Local Loop up as a member of Mutual, following a commons governance model. It's a data commons, you might say. So that's kind of what that is. And then, yeah, because this is a startup pitch, obviously they want to know how much money we're going to make from this. But again, it's got to have a business model. It's if we want to like launch this and grow it and scale it and replicate it, we've got to figure out, you know, how we're going to price it and how much it's going to cost to run this thing. And the nice thing is the numbers look pretty rosy, honestly, because once you've built the system, it's very, very cheap to operate. It's just data processing, basically. There's a lot of businesses in the Liverpool City region, and if you know, take a simple software as a service kind of type pricing model, you could easily imagine making some quite significant amounts of money quite quickly. So, yeah.
What is Sam and Tom?
Oh, sorry, it's these like venture capitalist startup terms. It's like TAM is total addressable market. Yeah, Sam is serviceable addressable market. I think Tom is total obtainable market, and nobody subsets. Yeah, nobody seems to quite understand. Like, you hear people bickering about how to calculate these things all the time. So it's mostly made up, if I'm honest. And you can easily get a different answer by changing the assumptions. So again, classic startup land. But yeah, so it feels like it meets some of those requirements as a proposition. Where we've actually got with building it is we have a super basic version of the app, which just does the first necessary thing, which is says you can connect to your Xero or your QuickBooks if you got them. And I'd say probably about half of small businesses at this point are using some kind of accounting platform. And we've got a system within our system which does those integrations very, very quickly now. So we can just roll out support for a whole range of different platforms. But Xero and QuickBooks are the two big ones in the UK. And we can do file upload for people who don't, just send us your PDFs basically. And this might actually work, you never know, a real demo. There we go, it's done it. So that's us piping in invoices from zero. And so we get a nice real-time feed, and that's great. And then what that looks like when you actually start to take a look at that. I've got some, nope, not there. This is the part at which, as I say, I'm kind of rooting around in my machine for show and tell. But I've got some anonymised data from a real business, a few real businesses in Liverpool City region who've done this, who've connected up zero. And that might be it. Oops, that's not it. Right, there we go. So that's what it looks like. You know, not surprising if you get one business's data. That's them, and then all of these smaller nodes around the outside of their customers. So this business.
Size of the circle, size of the payments, or
So, turnover, basically, yeah, total sales. And there's many ways of like representing this data. You can, you know, there's all sorts of lovely graph layout, you know, packages. But basically, yeah, here's the business in the center, which is kindly connected to zero. We can see all of their sales to all of their customers. It's then not hard to figure out which of those are in Liverpool City region and which aren't. And then we can find the ones which are also good candidates for signing up, and we can start to go and approach them and say, oh, right, well, why don't you connect your zero as well? And then once you've done that a few times, you might expect to start to see something maybe a bit like that starts to emerge. You start to get an actual network view of debts, outstanding debts in the economy, who owes what to whom at any given time, basically. And that's, you know, you can do all sorts with that. Clearing is just the first thing we know how to do. Basically, once you've got the raw data, all sorts of graph algorithms, you can turn all sorts of stuff in it and learn all sorts about the local economy. And again, this is like, for me, part of understanding what the missing middle actually is, because the government, the kind of macro statistical stuff, this is invisible to the growth and evolution of these networks. It's also invisible to any given member, hence why we have to aggregate the data and, you know, process it to get this lens. But it's an incredibly powerful lens on the economy. And just to give you an idea of what clearing looks like on a really large data set, a collaborator of ours who is basically the world expert in this stuff obtained a data set. I think this is 40,000 Italian SMEs. He got it from like an invoice factoring company. And what this shows is in the middle here, you've got the 40,000 odd businesses, you know, each one is too small to see as a node, but they're all in there. And then obviously they're connected by their debts to each other. So that's the graph. And again, if you say, okay, well, given the debts which are outstanding between these entities, we want to pay as much of that debt using the least amount of money. So recasting it as an optimization problem on a graph. The first thing you do is introduce like a source and a sink node. And typically, like, you know, that would be a bank. It's like, where's the money going to come from? Well, it's got to come from someone's bank account. Where's it got to end up? It's got to end up in someone else's bank account. That's what happens when you make payments. Money just moves between bank accounts. And so to set up the optimization problem, you say, right, you simplify things right down. In reality, there's a lot of banks, a lot of bank accounts, but you can model it as single source, single sink. And you say, what's got to happen is the money has to go from the businesses which are in debt and have outstanding invoices they've received, and it's got to go to the business which has issued those invoices, and you want to do that as efficiently as possible. And so yeah, got the source node on the left, sink node on the right. This, even though this has actually been like arranged, this graph, you can still see it's just a total tangle of debt. Like, it's just a complete mess. You know, no wonder payments get delayed all the time. You know, it's just a complete, you know, yeah, it's a mess. And then you run the clearing algorithm. And the really amazing thing is you can actually clear or discharge a huge percentage of debt without any money moving at all in the first place. And that's because these networks always have cyclical structures. There are always loops where the simplest one being business A owes business B and business B owes business A. And then it's really obvious. You can just cancel out and say, oh, I owe you £10, but you owe me £5. I just got to give you £5. Actually, if you look at these economic trading networks, you'll typically find loops of length like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but obviously no one can see them because nobody's looking for them, nobody's collecting the data, but they absolutely emerge past a certain network density. And you can do the exact same bookkeeping operation of just say, we all owe each other in a loop, and this is where the name Local Loop comes from. Let's just do a dead simple bookkeeping operation where we just cancel out the smallest amount around the loop. And that discharges a significant fraction of the debt without any payments being made at all. So that's what that looks like. You simplify the network right down by removing the cyclical component. That's the proportion of the economy which is already circular. And in a Western economy, it's typically like between 10 and 20%. We've got long supply chains. We do a lot of import-export. If you look at data sets from developing economies like Kenya, for example, they're much more circular. And that's, of course, because they're subsistence economies where in the village you import like fuel, electricity, mobile phone credits, but mostly it's just people buying and selling from each other. And you can just almost dispense with the need for cash if you have the data and you can run these algorithms. They're at the opposite end, an extreme other end of the spectrum, whereas we're like super industrialized, super long supply chains. And there's actually very little circularity left in our communities. But again, the powerful thing is this rewards circularity. It finds where the circularity is still remaining, and it says the more of that you've got going on in your business, the better connected you are to your local business community. The more circularity you can create, the less money you need, the more we can decouple you from the predatory financial system, the better we can make your cash flow. And so that for us is like, that's the systemic change thing. We can actually reward that at scale. So yeah, you start by removing the cyclical component, and that's the debt you can eliminate without any money moving around. You've still got a lot left, of course, but what you've got left are chains, and those are first of all much simpler to deal with. They're much less hairy than the cycles. That's when you've got to start moving money around, and so that's when you need to start working with a payment services provider. But nonetheless, because of your knowledge of the network structure, you can still eliminate a huge proportion of the debt with hardly any money at all. You can just eliminate the need for a massive amount of the money supply, just by working with rather than against the network. And that's what's actually going on under the hood of Local Loop. And so where we're at the moment is we're building the platform. We are hoping to have an MVP by the end of the year, where businesses will just be able to connect their invoices, review which ones they want to go in for clearing, and then every 28 days just get a set of bookkeeping instructions saying this debt's been cleared for you, you don't have to pay it anymore. And then we'll layer on these further mechanisms, which start with this thing I just showed you, which is technically called liquidity injection, where you just take the existing money, bank money, and you just make really efficient use of it. What we want to work towards is full-on mutual credit systems, where we're approaching subsets of businesses which have loads of circularity and a really high appetite for collaboration, and saying to them, you guys are already financing yourselves with your invoices. You've already got this incredibly high, you're this cluster basically, and you basically, first of all, you don't need that much money of any sort, but you're in a really strong position to actually start issuing your own credit. And that's the full-blown credit commons, where the real productive economy of businesses and communities are financing themselves, increasingly decoupled from the banking system, basically. So that's the end game.
It's really weird for me. I think some of this is why I remain positive in all this space, despite the reasons to be concerned and so on. So I was involved in London in the mid-1990s. There's a startup that came along to us. I was in a big technology firm. They're called Direct Credit Exchange, and it was exactly this, basically. They created what now we call tokens, but they call them direct credits. So they were these units, basically, and it was exactly this idea of netting off, across a system, across a supply chain. And theirs was using these direct credits, these tokens that would get traded and stuff. And it sort of got lost in it, and so some of these things are just about timing.
Absolutely, yeah.
These guys were ahead of their time, really. We engaged with Tesco. And the argument was if you had a big supplier, Tesco's obviously got tons and tons of suppliers, and so you've got a system. We also looked at things like could you do it in somewhere like the Isle of Man, an enclosed geographic system? You know,
Ireland's are really good
you know,
candidates.
that
Yeah,
sort of thing
yeah,
and stuff.
yeah.
But its rules have just got a bit lost
Mhm.
and so on. And my guess is, I don't really follow these things in detail, but my guess is that's what the likes of Stripe are thinking about with stable coins. The podcast that I've heard, that because obviously loads of cryptos just gobbled and
Yeah.
scams, but some of it sounds. And my understanding of stable coins, there might be some more serious thinking there, and Stripe are engaged in stable coins.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of that, especially inter-country,
Mhm.
that's enough, type thinking.
Oh, I mean, that's just wild what's happening with stable coins at the moment. As you say, some of them have kind of grown up a bit, and one of our advisors to the project who actually pays serious attention to the crypto world because he's in it, quoted me some astonishing statistic that because some of the more mature stablecoin systems are actually, as I say, quite mature, they are now much cheaper than the traditional, foreign exchange mechanisms.
Yeah.
And the volume of trade going through stablecoins is just it runs to the billions, if not trillions, at this stage. It's just happens so quickly and so fast. And of course, a lot of the Trump administration over in the US is pushing this agenda really, really hard. As far as I can tell, though, and of course, the corporates like Stripe are piling in because what the hell wouldn't they, basically? So I mean, and this is fintech is mostly the merger of big tech and big finance. It's like the tip of the spear of turbo capitalism. As far as we can tell, there are very few people working along the lines we are with the kind of network science and credit understanding of things. The crypto space itself, it's got a lot of ideological blinkers, particularly around money as a commodity. That was very much the origin of crypto. And although the stablecoin people are a bit different, and in some ways more sophisticated, their basic orientation towards money is still that it ought to be a commodity, or that it behaves like a commodity, and that is a self-imposed blindness to the possibilities opened up when you actually analyse the money as a credit-based system. These algorithms, I think, there's some published literature on them. Some studies have been done running them on crypto data sets. They have very, very weird network structures, though, because they have almost no bearing on the real economy for the most part. The crypto sphere is just completely detached from real economic activity. And so you see radically different network structures compared to what actual trading looks like. And so, how that plays out when you run these algorithms on them is that in itself is I'm sure there's some weird stuff out there. Yeah.
I think you need to find ways to incentivise the right behaviours in these things, don't you? So, it's not my field, but there's a company called Remitly, and they do that sort of. Anyone, say, working here, sending money back to a country in Africa, you pay a hell of a lot of fees and so on. And so Remitly is in that sort of space, and they might be getting disintermediated by some of the crypto stuff, I don't know. But they were in there trying to offer better service to encourage that, because lots of people sending it back to families and things. And that seems to be a question for you guys to think about. Is how do you incentivise money that stays in the local economy?
Yeah.
Trading with local. So say I'm in Liverpool and I trade with someone in Iceland or something. Does the system incentivise me to find an alternative supplier in Liverpool?
Yeah, and for us that's the beauty of it. It's that the more of your trade you do locally, the more likely you are for us to be able to clear your debts, and the better your cash flow will be. So there absolutely is a direct financial incentive to do exactly that, is to localise your supply chain. Of course, I don't expect that will be a dynamic which plays out over years and decades, rather than suddenly Local Loop exists, therefore I'm going to do only trade locally, and we don't want to be an autarky anyway. We wouldn't want, we can't make everything here, we just can't. So for me, it's a question of balance. It's we can't, we don't want to go back in the direction of a subsistence village where, because everything is made locally, the variety on offer is frankly incredibly low, and there's just not much going on. Do we want to be in this kind of hyper-modernised, globalised state where we're totally reliant on these massively overextended supply chains which could collapse at any time and nothing is made locally? No, we don't want that either. For me, what this does is it does actually like start to shift the balance back in the direction of local. And yeah, you are rewarded for trading and buying and selling locally, not because of some kind of like badge or like points-based system, but it is just good for your business finances. It's as simple as that. That for me is much of the, that's why I'm working on this basically, you know, because for me it combines that, what's in it for me, the simple, straightforward value proposition with the systems change feedback loops in a way which nothing else I've seen does, frankly. You know, that's, and if I knew of something which did that better, I'd do that instead.
What was the idea of things like the fixed and bound, wasn't it? It's a local currency.
Yeah.
Keep the money local.
Yeah, but there's no, outside of novelty, they have no value proposition,
Yeah, well,
honestly.
it just doesn't scale, it hasn't sustained.
Yeah, yeah.
Can this help identify who you should be trading with, like who's got the most dense local?
I think that's another really interesting opportunity is exactly some kind of brokering where it's saying, oh yeah, if you want to like, if you want to like do more local trade, and particularly if you want to increase your odds of getting a good result from Local Loop and getting paid on time, we recommend that you know, trade with this person, and that could be a really interesting like, see you later, Margaret. No, not until we're late. So yeah. Yeah, no, there's totally an opportunity for some kind of like brokering service based on your knowledge of the network structure, what sectors are involved, you know,
Yeah.
who's looking to buy more locally, who's looking to sell more locally. It's all there to be done.
It's like a spiral graph.
Oh yeah, that's
That's lovely.
Remember those things
Yeah.
with the pen?
one month of spending by Liverpool City Council.
Oh, okay.
Pulled down the data if it's publicly available. And so I think someone mentioned Tesco previously,
Yeah.
and saying, oh, that's what a super connector looks like. That's what, you know, a big local spender looks like, whether it's Tesco or the City Council. So not surprising, we'd be very keen if they got involved, because if they did, and they also joined up to their, I think there's 1,000 unique suppliers in there. I don't know how many of them are local, but let's say for the sake of argument, even 20% of those are local businesses. If they can pull them in, we've got a network, and we can start to do some really, like, that's when it gets really exciting, is when we get these super connectors involved. So yeah, at some point we'll go talk to the council of universities, the hospitals, and say you ought to be putting your invoices into Local Loop.
That'll scare the bejesus out.
Yeah, they won't be the early adopters at all. They won't be the early adopters, but you know, if the small business community buys into it, and it's clearly doing good for the local economy, you know, and it supports a lot of their policy aims around circular economy, community wealth building, you know, all of their buzzwords, you know, they ought to, and it's fintech as well, so it's innovative, you know. It ought to be able to get someone's attention.
You, I don't know how I misunderstand it. Is it ideologically you're choosing the credit because you like the building of the relationships on that side of the economic trade? I'm just wondering whether including commodities as well, such as people's waste, so for example, there might be a cabinet maker as large offcuts of wood that actually has value, but
Yeah.
to them it's a cost because they've got to really store it and bin it.
Mm-hmm.
And then including that in this kind of circular.
That's what I was kind of talking about before with the white fields. Like, oh, we didn't actually realise this was useful.
Yeah.
It's
So the way, yeah, I mean, so I'm sure there will be a way to integrate it. You wouldn't be able to do it directly because in order to do clearing, there has to be an outstanding like credit debt relationship, in this case invoices. And you know, if I've got, you know, some leftover wood, for example, that's a thing, not a relationship. And so I can't like, oh, put the wood in for clearing. It's just like, it's just a category error type thing. So this can only deal with financial obligations. Then we're back in the territory of saying, okay, well, perhaps we could create a financial obligation backed by the value of that wood, which could in some sense be connected into the network of other obligations. And that's when you're into the monetary theory territory and saying, well, what would a financial obligation backed by spare wood even, like, who would accept that as a means of payment? And that is monetary theory. Who will accept what credit instruments as means of payment? And that itself is a design space for me. And so I'd very much like to get to the point where if there's like a community project which has some asset or some value which it wants to find a way to plug into these networks, that can be done in a way which is not naive or risky or unacceptable to other people involved. And that, again, like, there's monetary theory there, there's governance, there's network science, it's the whole lot has to be taken into account. in order to design and pull that off properly. And it, absolutely, it's you know, something I'd love to. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Time banking would fit right into this actually, because like a time bank is a credit system as well. It's saying, well, I've done 5 hours, you know, for your project, and so my credit is now plus 5 hours, and you can redeem those credits against other people in the network. So that is actually, you know, yeah, that's you could absolutely plug a time bank. I mentioned at the start, I came to this stuff via the mutual credit space, and like time banking is just a variant of mutual credit, and our roadmap down the line is absolutely to integrate the local loop system with the credit commons protocol I mentioned way back, which is a mutual credit protocol which can accommodate things like time banking, where you can declare your own unit of account. So you could say, we're a time bank in Liverpool, and this is our hours accounting system. You could plug that into local loop or into other mutual credit systems using different currencies or different units of account, and you could all trade with each other and have that like interoperable without like melting yourself into, you know, another project or something you didn't disagree with. So integrating a time bank would be totally feasible into this, and that's absolutely where we want to go in the long run.
Waste of energy seems like good, because you're taking a restaurant's organic waste and then potentially selling them back electricity generated from their waste.
I'm sure there'd be a way to do it. Yeah, energy ledgers are very interesting. You know, I mean, okay, so if you're let's say you've got a facility and it runs up a utility bill and you have to pay that off, you know, every month for the sake of argument. If you could be credited on your utility bill against, you know, the waste which you've provided in order to generate electricity, you know, absolutely that sort of thing ought to be like pretty straightforward.
Maybe you can then leverage that into local government as a cost saving for them.
Yep.
And a cost benefit
Yep.
for them, and you save them money.
Yeah.
So then you get like relief or something.
That's a really interesting thing. Actually, a lot of European projects have an advantage, in as much as local governments often have much greater taxation powers than they do in the UK. What you really want to do to get like a local currency or a mutual credit system going is to get the local authority to accept your credits as payment of business rates, and then everyone will accept them. It's like, oh great, I can pay my taxes with these. Fantastic, it's almost as good as the euro. And obviously that, again, is that monetary theory thing. What makes the euro acceptable as a means of payment? It's because the government puts you in prison if you don't pay your taxes in euros. And if you live in a country where you're fortunate enough to have a local government which actually has some taxation authority, and you can get them on side, they can absolutely anchor your network and make it much more viable. Again, in the UK, local government, like, you know, have far fewer kind of freedoms. But yeah, like building a connection with local authorities, even if it's not direct to the point where you can get them to accept your credits for like business taxes or business rates or whatever, which is the dream, you can still probably, like, if you can, you know, present it the right way and talk to the right person, I'm sure you could design something like what you're describing, which would also boost the system and help, you know, plug into the network in the right way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Is there a way that could be something that this and this other?
Down the line, yeah, like the really basic MVP of Local Loop we're launching just says it just accepts invoices denominated in pounds GBP. Like, that's the simplest, lowest risk, dumbest thing we can build to get this off the ground. But the point is that it opens up all sorts of opportunities. So yeah, for the time being, unless you're a business which is buying and selling in Liverpool City region, issuing and receiving invoices, you know, that's all that Local Loop can handle right now. But absolutely, like, you know, the roadmap absolutely includes how do we like branch out beyond that. But again, we're honestly in this quite kind of, you know, very like brutally disciplined tech mindset at the moment, where like it's minimum viable product. If it's not going to get you to market faster before you run out of money, we're not doing it. It's like completely laser focus is where we're at the moment. Just get to market as quickly as you can, start making some revenue so you're not just always in an existential panic, and then grow from there and start doing the more ambitious stuff. So there's a million things we'd love to do and know how to do, and think, if we can find the right people to collaborate with, we'd love to build. But right now we're just blinkers on, sadly. But yeah, like, yeah, further, absolutely. It's again, I got into this precisely because I don't actually I'm not a finance person, I'm not a tech person. Physics was my thing. I stopped doing that to do this. Do I want to be doing this for the rest of my life? No. There's many other things I would frankly rather be doing with my life, but this feels like the work I can most usefully do right now. But I'm not intending to be, the great thing is we've got more and more people paying attention, supporting us, wanting to find a way to get involved. That's a huge part of what we set out to do, was just to not just be alone with this stuff. We want to take it mainstream, and then honestly free our deal. Obviously no deal. Honestly free ourselves up from the tech and the commercial stuff, and just do research and development and develop the ideas. Work on projects which feel much more kind of nourishing, should we say, rather than just fintech, which feels pretty, is honestly pretty alienating most of the time.
Cool. I mean, that feels like you can come back and talk next to the Salon.
Yeah.
How are you going to do the coffee and wood waste commons, when that bit gets developed in a year or two?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Cool.
when there's commons sprouting up left, right, and centre across Liverpool, I'll be the first to want to kind of, say more.
Cool. Well, thanks for that, Tom.
Thank you all. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming.
Thanks for all of us.
Really good. I quite like this kind of slightly more chatty kind of approach to things and stuff. Yeah. That was good. And hopefully see you all on the 8th of October, if not at the Hack Day or other things before that.